There is a field in Tuscany where the grass grows pale gold in summer, where the light falls soft and white across marble that has stood since before the memory of any living thing now walking there, and where a tower rises from the earth at an angle that the eye, even after 8 centuries of learning to expect it, still struggles to accept. It leans. It has always leaned, or very nearly always, and yet it has never fallen. This is the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and it stands within the Field of Miracles, the Campo dei Miracoli, alongside a cathedral and a baptistery of the same pale stone in the city of Pisa, on the western coast of Italy, where the river Arno once carried ships from the sea into the heart of the town. The tower has stood, tilted, through 800 years of wind that has come off the Ligurian coast, through floods that have crept up from the river more times than any single record can account for, through wars that passed near enough to shake the ground, and through the slow, patient erosion of centuries that has worn away lesser structures built on firmer ground with straighter walls. It has stood while the material beneath it continued, and continues even now, to shift. To understand why this is strange, why it is, in the fullest sense of the word, a wonder, one must first understand what a leaning tower of this height and this weight ought to do. A structure of stone, rising some 56 meters on its higher side and considerably less on the side that has sunk into the earth, carries an immense load down through its base into the ground beneath it. When that structure stands upright, the load is carried evenly, spread across the foundation, the way weight is spread across the sole of a foot planted flat on the floor. But when a structure of that height begins to tilt, the load no longer distributes itself evenly. It concentrates. It gathers along the leaning edge, pressing down with a force that grows heavier the further the tilt progresses. The way a person leaning further and further off balance feels the weight collect more and more in the leg they lean toward, until at some point, and every engineer who has studied this tower agrees that such a point exists, the structure passes beyond what its own foundation can bear, and it comes down. This is not merely a modern anxiety projected backward onto an old building. It is a mathematical certainty, calculated more than once by engineers working in more than one century, using more than one method, and arriving at broadly the same unsettling conclusion. There is an angle beyond which a leaning tower of this shape and this mass cannot remain standing, no matter how well its stones were cut or how carefully its courses were laid. It will topple, as surely as a tree leaning far enough into open air will eventually come down under its own leaning weight, because past a certain point, the geometry of the thing works against it more forcefully than any strength of material can resist. The tower in Pisa has, at various points in its long life, leaned closer to that theoretical threshold than any comparable structure has ever leaned and survived. There were decades, particularly in the final years of the 20th century, when engineers examining the tower's tilt watched the numbers creep toward the edge of what their own calculations told them was survivable, and they did not know, with any real confidence, how much further the ground beneath it might allow it to go before physics settled the question on its own terms. And yet it did not fall. It has never fallen. This is the paradox that sits at the center of the tower's identity, and it is the paradox that will guide everything that follows in this chronicle. Not simply the strange fact of a leaning building, which is remarkable enough on its own, but the far stranger fact of a leaning building that continued leaning, year after year, century after century, and somehow always stopped just short of the fall that seemed, by every calculation, inevitable. The tower should not exist in the form it exists in today. According to the plain mechanics of stone and gravity, it ought to have joined the long list of ambitious structures throughout history that reached too far, trusted too much in ground that could not hold them, and returned to the earth in a single afternoon of collapse. Instead, it has become perhaps the most famous surviving example of exactly the opposite outcome. A structure that failed, in the sense that its foundation gave way beneath it almost from the very beginning, and yet somehow did not fail in the way that failure usually ends, with rubble and silence. It failed slowly, softly, and it kept on standing while it failed, which is a far stranger thing to accomplish than simply standing straight and true the way its builders had originally intended. The reason for this reaches back to the very ground on which the tower was built, long before the first stone was ever set into place. Pisa sits on a plain formed by centuries of river deposits, soft layers of clay and sand and silt, laid down by the Arno and by the sea that once lapped closer to the city than it does today. It is, in the language later engineers would use, poorly consolidated ground, soil that has not been compressed and hardened over geological time the way rock or dense clay elsewhere might be. Soil that behaves less like a solid foundation and more like something caught in the slow process of becoming one. When the builders of the tower began their work in the 12th century, they had no instruments capable of measuring what lay beneath the meadow where they broke ground. They could not have known, in any precise or scientific sense, that they were building atop a foundation that would betray them almost from the moment weight was placed upon it. But the ground knew, and within a few years of construction, the ground began to tell them, tilting the rising structure ever so slightly to one side, in a movement so gradual that it likely went unnoticed for some time, and so persistent that it has never, in 8 centuries, fully stopped. What makes the story of this tower so quietly astonishing is not only that a flaw in the earth produced a flaw in the structure. Such things have happened elsewhere, and elsewhere the outcome has often been collapse, abandonment, or a builder's decision to tear down and start again on firmer ground. What makes Pisa's tower different is that its builders, faced across multiple generations with a structure visibly and undeniably leaning, chose instead to continue building upward, adjusting as they went, compensating in small and imperfect ways for a tilt they could not correct outright. The flaw did not stop the tower from becoming a tower. Instead, the flaw became the tower's defining feature, its strange signature written into stone, carried upward course by course across a construction that would eventually span nearly 2 centuries from its beginning to its true completion. What was meant to rise straight and proud into the Tuscan sky instead rose leaning, and in that leaning became something far more remarkable and far more studied than a perfectly vertical bell tower ever could have been. This, then, is the story this chronicle will follow slowly, the way the tower itself has moved through its history. Not swiftly, not dramatically, but with the patient accumulation of centuries. It is the story of a city that grew wealthy on trade and maritime power, and decided, in that wealth, to build something worthy of its ambitions. It is the story of a field chosen for its softness rather than in spite of it, a decision that would only reveal its consequences slowly, over years and then decades. It is the story of builders who paused their work for nearly a century, whether by war or by simple caution, and who may have unknowingly saved the tower by giving the ground time to settle before more weight was added above it. It is the story of the tower's long life afterward. Bells rung from its leaning chamber, scholars and scientists who came to study its strange geometry, engineers of the modern age who watched its lean approach, a threshold that frightened them, and the extraordinary painstaking work undertaken to correct that lean just enough to secure the tower's future, without erasing the very imperfection that has made it beloved. For now, in this quiet opening, it is enough to hold the central image steady in mind. A white tower of marble and stone, rising at an angle that appears, to any eye seeing it for the first time, like something caught mid-fall and frozen there by an act of mercy. It has stood this way for the better part of a millennium. It should not have, and the story of why it has. The story of soft ground and stubborn builders, of centuries of sinking and decades of careful, anxious study, of an engineering rescue that came almost, but not quite, too late, is the story this chronicle will now begin to tell, slowly, the way the tower itself has always moved, one settling year at a time. Before that story continues, let this be a quiet invitation. If you find comfort in the long, patient histories of the structures human hands have raised against gravity and time, consider settling in and perhaps subscribing so that more of these chronicles might find their way to you as you rest. To understand why the tower rose at all, and why it was permitted to lean for so many generations before anyone thought to arrest its fall, one must first understand the city that raised it, and the particular kind of pride that filled Pisa in the years before the first stone was ever set upon the ground. In the 11th century, Pisa was not the quiet provincial city that travelers know today, a place visited chiefly for the curiosity of its tilted tower. It was, in that earlier century, one of the great maritime powers of the Mediterranean, a republic whose ships carried goods and soldiers and pilgrims across waters that stretched from the coasts of Spain to the shores of the Levant, and whose merchants and admirals had grown wealthy on the profits of trade, conquest, and the careful administration of a growing empire of influence. The Arno River, which still moves gently through the city today, once connected Pisa directly to the sea, and it was along this water that the wealth of distant ports first arrived, carried in the holds of galleys built in Pisan yards and sailed by Pisan crews who had learned to read the winds of the Western Mediterranean as well as any sailors of their age. This was the era of the maritime republics, when cities such as Pisa, Genoa, Venice, and Amalfi competed not only for trade routes and naval dominance, but for a kind of civic prestige that could only be expressed through the visible accumulation of wealth translated into stone. Pisa's particular moment of ascendancy came through a combination of military success and commercial opportunity. Pisan fleets had taken part in campaigns against Muslim strongholds in Sardinia and Sicily, and had profited from the plunder and trading rights that followed such victories. Pisan merchants had established colonies and trading posts in cities along the coast of North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, securing for their home city a share of the lucrative exchange in silk, spices, metalwork, and the countless other goods that moved between Europe and the wider world. By the middle of the 11th century, Pisa's naval power had grown to the point where the city could claim, with some justification, to be the preeminent maritime force of the Western Mediterranean, and its coffers had swelled correspondingly, filled with the profits of trade routes that stretched further than most of its citizens would ever personally travel. Wealth of this kind, arriving steadily over generations, tends to seek expression. It is rarely enough for a city to simply possess riches. There is, in the civic character of such places, a persistent desire to make that wealth visible, to translate the abstract accumulation of coin and cargo into something that can be seen, touched, and admired by visitors and rivals alike. In Pisa, as in Venice and Genoa in their own turns, this impulse found its outlet in architecture, and specifically in religious architecture. For, in that century, the boundary between civic pride and religious devotion was thin indeed. A great cathedral was not merely a place of worship. It was a declaration, made in stone and marble, that a city had arrived at a station in the world worthy of God's grandest houses. The Pisans, flush with the profits of their fleets and their conquests, resolved to build such a declaration for themselves, and they resolved to build it well beyond what mere necessity required. The result was the beginning of what would come to be called, centuries later, the Field of Miracles, though in the 11th century it bore no such poetic name. It was, at its outset, simply a plan, ambitious even by the standards of an ambitious age, to raise upon a stretch of open ground at the edge of the city a religious complex unlike anything that had been attempted in the region before. The plan called for a cathedral of extraordinary scale, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, to be built in celebration of and thanksgiving for a great naval victory the Pisans had won against a Muslim fleet off the coast of Sicily in the year 1063. The victory had brought with it not only strategic advantage, but substantial plunder. And it was this plunder, according to the accounts that survive, which helped fund the beginning of the cathedral's construction. Work on the cathedral itself began in the following years, and it rose slowly over subsequent decades, a building of striking white and grey marble, its facade arranged in tiers of blind arcading that would come to influence religious architecture across the region for generations afterward. But the Pisans did not intend to stop at a cathedral alone. The plan for the field envisioned a complete complex, one that would serve every function a great religious centre required. A place for baptism, a place for burial, a place for worship, and a place from which the sound of consecrated bells could summon the faithful and mark the hours of civic and spiritual life. In time, this vision would produce not only the cathedral, but a freestanding baptistry, circular in form and rising to a considerable height of its own, along with a cemetery enclosed within covered arcades. And finally, the structure with which this chronicle is chiefly concerned. A campanile, a bell tower, to stand apart from the cathedral and complete the ensemble. The decision to build the bell tower as a separate structure, rather than integrating it into the body of the cathedral itself, deserves some attention, for it was not the only architectural tradition available to the builders of that century. In many parts of Europe, bell towers were raised directly from the body of the church, rising from a corner of the transept or from above the main entrance, structurally bound to the cathedral they served. But in central Italy, and particularly in Tuscany, a different tradition had taken hold, one in which the campanile stood apart, a tower in its own right, freestanding upon the ground, connected to its cathedral only by proximity and purpose, rather than by shared walls or shared foundations. This tradition can be traced in other Tuscan cities of the period, and it reflects, in part, a particular understanding of what a bell tower was meant to be. Not merely an appendage to a church, but a monument unto itself. A vertical marker upon the skyline, visible from a great distance, announcing the presence of the sacred complex below. To travelers approaching the city long before they could see the cathedral's facade or hear its bells. For Pisa, a freestanding campanile carried an additional civic weight. A tower that stood alone, rising independently from the ground beside the cathedral and the baptistry, could be admired as an object of pure architectural ambition, its height and grace judged on their own terms, rather than as a mere feature of a larger building. It would be, in effect, a second monument within the same sacred field, a companion to the cathedral rather than a subordinate part of it. And this arrangement suited a city that wished to demonstrate not simply piety, but the range and depth of its architectural and engineering accomplishment. A cathedral alone might speak to devotion. A cathedral, a baptistry, and a freestanding tower together spoke to something larger, a city's confidence in its own permanence, its own mastery over stone and space, its own place among the great powers of its age. It is worth pausing here to note what this project was not. It was not conceived as a fortress, though Pisa, like every city of its era, had its share of defensive walls and towers built for military purpose. Nor was it conceived as a palace or a seat of secular government, though Pisa's civic institutions were themselves growing in sophistication and required their own buildings elsewhere in the city. The Field of Miracles and the campanile that would eventually rise upon it was conceived purely as an expression of faith intertwined with civic pride. a complex whose entire purpose was to glorify God, and, in glorifying God, to glorify Pisa itself as a city favored by fortune, blessed with wealth, and capable of building something that would endure long after the ships that had funded it had rotted in their harbors, and the admirals who had commanded them had been forgotten by all but the most careful chroniclers. This, then, was the calm and confident ambition that stood behind the eventual decision to build the bell tower. Not urgency, not military necessity, not the pragmatic requirements of a growing population in need of shelter or defense, but the patient, deliberate desire of a wealthy and successful city to mark its achievement in the most permanent material available to its age. Stone does not hurry, and neither, it seems, did the Pisans in the earliest stages of this project. The cathedral had already been decades in the building by the time thought turned seriously to the tower that would stand beside it, and the bell tower itself would take longer still to reach completion, its progress interrupted by forces no engineer of the 11th or 12th century could have anticipated. But in the beginning, before any stone had been laid for the tower itself, there was only this: a city rich from the sea, a field chosen at the city's edge, and a plan, ambitious and unhurried, to raise a monument that would announce to every ship approaching the mouth of the Arno that Pisa had arrived, and intended to be remembered. It was into this atmosphere of confidence, and onto this particular stretch of ground, that the builders would eventually bring their tools, their measurements, and their marble. What they would discover beneath their feet, before a single visible course of stone could rise into the shape the world now recognizes, would test that confidence in ways the city's admirals and merchants could scarcely have imagined. Beneath the grass of the Campo dei Miracoli, beneath the place where the masons would soon mark out their circles and lay their first courses of stone, lay a history far older and far less visible than the one Pisa's merchants liked to tell about themselves. It was a history written not in ledgers or treaties, but in sediment, laid down slowly over thousands of years by rivers that had long since forgotten the paths they once carved. The ground of the Pisan plain was not rock. It was not even, in any firm sense, earth as a builder might hope to find it. It was accumulation, layer upon layer of clay, fine sand, and the crushed remains of ancient shells, pressed together by time, but never hardened into anything resembling stone. It was, in the plainest terms available to the language of construction, unreliable. And it was upon this unreliable ground, chosen for its beauty and its nearness to the river, that the tower's foundation would eventually be set. The plain on which Pisa stood had been shaped by two rivers, the Arno to the south and the Circio to the north, both of which had wandered across this stretch of Tuscany for millennia, shifting their courses, flooding their banks, and leaving behind them the fine, waterlogged deposits that rivers leave when they slow and spread across low ground. Where a river runs fast, it carries away what it disturbs. Where it slows, as it does when a plain flattens out before reaching the sea, it releases what it carries, and over centuries these releases compound into strata, soft, mixed, and saturated. This was the process that had built the ground beneath Pisa, long before there was a Pisa to speak of, and it was a process that cared nothing for the ambitions of the city that would one day rise upon it. Anyone who dug into that ground, even a modest distance down, would find water waiting for them. The water table beneath the Pisan plain sat close to the surface, fed by the rivers that bordered it, and by the sea that lay only a short distance to the west. This meant that the layers of clay and sand into which any foundation might be sunk were not merely soft, but saturated, heavy with moisture that had nowhere to drain, held within the sediment the way water is held within a sponge. Clay of this kind behaves differently from drier ground. Under steady pressure, it does not simply resist. It yields slowly and unevenly. compressing in places, shifting in others, settling not as a single unified mass, but as a patchwork of small, uncoordinated movements that together can tilt whatever rests above it. Fine sand, layered between the clay, added its own instability, prone to settling further should the water within it ever be disturbed or redistributed by the weight pressing down from above. Had a modern engineer been given the chance to walk that ground before construction began, carrying with them the instruments and the accumulated knowledge of centuries not yet lived, they would have recognized immediately the nature of the risk. They would have called for borings, for samples drawn up from different depths, for careful mapping of where the clay gave way to sand and where the sand gave way again to clay, for measurements of how much a given load might cause each layer to compress and over what span of time. They would have asked how deep a foundation needed to reach before it found ground firm enough to carry the enormous weight of a bell tower rising, as this one was intended to rise, through several stories of marble and stone. They would have wanted, above all, to know what lay beneath the beauty of that green field before allowing anything permanent to be built upon it. But this was the 12th century, and the tools for asking such questions in any systematic way did not yet exist. There were no soil surveys of the kind that would later become standard practice for any structure of significant weight. There was no science of geotechnical engineering, no understanding of clay consolidation as a measurable, predictable process, no means of testing what lay 6 or 10 or 20 feet beneath the surface before committing a design to that ground. The builders of the tower, like builders across medieval Europe, worked instead from experience, from what had been seen to hold in other places, from what tradition suggested about how deep a foundation ought to be dug, from the practical wisdom passed from master mason to apprentice across generations of building in stone. It was a form of knowledge that had raised cathedrals and fortresses across the continent, and it was not without its own kind of rigor, but it was fundamentally different from the calculated, tested confidence that later centuries would demand before breaking ground on a structure of comparable ambition. In most places, this experiential approach served well enough. Builders had learned, through the accumulated failures and successes of earlier generations, roughly how deep a foundation needed to be for ordinary ground, roughly how wide it needed to spread to distribute a heavy load, roughly what signs in the earth suggested firmness and what signs suggested caution. But the ground beneath the Campo dei Miracoli was not ordinary ground, and the depth to which medieval builders customarily sank their foundations, adequate for firmer soils elsewhere in Tuscany and across Italy, would prove wholly insufficient for the layered, saturated clay and sand that lay beneath Pisa's chosen field. The foundation eventually laid for the tower reached down only a modest distance before its builders judged it sufficient and began to raise the visible structure above it. It was a judgment made with the best information available to men of their era, and it was a judgment that the ground itself would spend the next 8 centuries quietly, patiently disputing. There is something almost unbearably poignant in retrospect about the confidence with which that field was chosen. The merchants and admirals of Pisa had looked upon that stretch of grass near the cathedral and seen only opportunity, proximity to the river, proximity to the sea, a setting worthy of the monument they intended to raise. They had not seen, because there was no way for them to see, the centuries of river sediment compressed beneath the surface, the water sitting patiently within the clay, the fine sand shifting almost imperceptibly beneath whatever weight might eventually be asked to rest upon it. The ground kept its secrets in a language that the 12th century did not yet know how to read, and so the builders proceeded as builders across the medieval world routinely proceeded, with faith in tradition, with faith in their own accumulated skill, and without the deeper, more searching questions that a modern foundation engineer would have insisted upon before allowing so much as a cornerstone to be set. It is worth pausing here, on what this meant for the tower before it existed at all, before a single visible stone had been raised, before the bell chamber had even been imagined in any architect's mind. The true adversary of this structure, the opponent that would shape its history more profoundly than any war, any siege, any change in the fortunes of the republic that commissioned it, was already in place, waiting beneath the surface of a quiet green field. It was not a rival architect, nor a hostile army, nor even the ordinary ravages of time upon marble and stone. It was the ground itself, patient, invisible, indifferent to ambition, and entirely unmoved by the confidence of the men who walked across it toward the site where they intended to build something that would last forever. This is the quiet, foreboding truth that sits beneath every account of the tower's construction. Even the earliest chapters, even before the first course of stone had been laid. The wind that would later press against its rising height, the weight of each additional story added across the centuries, the slow accumulation of marble upon marble. All of this would matter, and all of this would test the structure in its own way. But none of it would matter nearly so much as what the soil beneath the tower's foundation was already doing, silently and continuously, long before anyone thought to measure it. Clay does not announce its intentions. Water sitting within sediment gives no warning before it begins, under new pressure, to redistribute itself in ways that shift everything resting above. The builders who chose this ground, and the masons who would soon begin sinking a foundation into it, could not have known the full extent of what they were setting in motion. They understood stone, they understood weight in the practical sense that any builder of their era understood weight. How much a column could bear, how thick a wall needed to be to support a vault, how deep a foundation ought to run for ground of ordinary firmness. What they could not understand, because the science to understand it would not exist for centuries, was the precise, compounding, uneven way in which soft ground yields beneath a tall and heavy structure. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic failure, but slowly, unevenly, one side settling further than the other, across years, across decades, across centuries, in a process that would come to define this tower more than any other feature of its design. The stage, then, was set before it was set. The field had been chosen, the ambition had been declared, and beneath the grass where the first stones would soon be laid, water sat quietly within layers of clay and sand, waiting, as it had waited for thousands of years already, for something heavy enough to ask it to move. In the year 1173, according to the date most often given in the old chronicles and repeated by historians ever since, the people of Pisa began to build. There is no surviving document from that year signed by an architect, no contract laid out in careful clauses naming the man responsible for the design, and so what remains is a tradition rather than a certainty. But it is a tradition old enough and consistent enough across independent sources that most historians accept it as close to the truth. The bell tower of the cathedral, the campanile that would stand apart from the church itself, as was the custom in that part of Italy, was begun in that year on the northern side of the cathedral square, in the soft ground that had already been prepared and levelled, and marked out with the wooden stakes and cords that medieval builders used to lay their foundations true. The name most often attached to this first phase of work is Bonanno Pisano, a bronze caster and sculptor known to have worked in Pisa during this period, whose name appears on other surviving works from the city, including a set of bronze doors made for the cathedral itself. Doors that were later lost to fire, but recorded well enough in written accounts to confirm his skill and his presence in the city at the right time. An inscription discovered in the base of the tower during excavations in the 19th century bears his name, and for a long while this was taken as settled proof that Bonanno was the architect of the tower entire, the man who conceived its form and oversaw its earliest stones. Yet the historical record complicates this simple story, as historical records so often do. Some scholars have questioned whether the inscription refers to the tower's design at all, or merely to some portion of decorative work Bonanno may have contributed, separate from the structural planning that would have been the province of a master mason or engineer whose name has not survived. Others have proposed different figures entirely, based on documents of uncertain reliability, and the debate has never fully resolved. What can be said with confidence is only this: that the tower's earliest stones were laid under the direction of someone skilled in the building traditions of Pisa in that century, someone familiar with the Romanesque style already visible in the cathedral and the baptistry beside which the tower would rise, and that whoever this person was, they made a decision in those first years that would shape everything the tower became. A decision about how deep to dig and how far to trust the ground. The foundation laid for the tower was shallow, by the standards that would come later, by the standards even of some buildings constructed centuries earlier. It was strikingly shallow, a ring of stone only a few meters in depth, sunk into the same soft layers of clay, sand and shell that lay beneath the whole of that low quarter of the city. The builders of the 12th century did not think in the terms that engineers would use in later ages to describe bearing capacity and soil consolidation. They thought, as builders long had, in terms of experience and precedent, of what had held elsewhere, of what looked and felt solid beneath the foot and the plumb line. A ring foundation of this shallow depth had likely proven adequate for other structures in other places, on ground firmer than this one, and there was no way for the builders of Pisa to know, standing on that grassy field in the 12th century, that the ground beneath their feet was unlike the ground that had held those other buildings up. The soil here was young, geologically speaking, deposited over thousands of years by rivers that had wandered and shifted across this coastal plain, laying down alternating bands of denser and looser material, some of it still holding water close beneath the surface, none of it consolidated into anything like solid bedrock. The foundation was, in effect, a wide stone disc, resting on a kind of firm, seeming crust over something closer to a very slow liquid, though no one alive at the time would have described it in such terms, and probably no one alive at the time suspected it at all. Atop this ring, the builders began to raise the tower's first level, a broad cylindrical drum of white and grey marble, quarried from the hills that ring the Tuscan countryside, brought down by cart and by river barge to the building site, then cut and dressed by masons whose names, like the architects, have mostly not survived. This first story was built with a confidence and a decorative richness that spoke to Pisa's wealth in that era. A city grown fat on trade across the Mediterranean, eager to declare its standing through the ambition of its buildings. The exterior of this ground level was ringed with blind arcades, a series of engaged columns and rounded arches set directly into the wall, purely decorative, adding no structural function but a great deal of visual rhythm and lightness to what was, underneath the ornament, a very thick and very heavy cylinder of stone. The capitals atop the columns were carved with the kind of classical detailing that Pisan builders favored in this period. Echoes of Roman and Byzantine forms filtered through the particular taste of the city's own workshops, patterns of leaves and geometric bands that would have taken skilled hands many months of careful, patient work to complete. Above this first story, the builders continued upward, adding a second level and then a third, each one following the same general plan as the one below, each one ringed with its own arcade, each one built from the same pale marble that would come, over the centuries, to define the tower's appearance to anyone who has ever seen a photograph of it. That soft, almost luminous white and grey, catching the light differently through the day, warm in early morning, cool and flat under overcast skies, gleaming at midday when the Tuscan sun stood high above the square. The rising structure, 3 stories tall now, must have presented an impressive sight to anyone crossing the field before the cathedral. A great cylindrical tower climbing story upon story, its surface alive with shadow and light thrown by the ranks of small arches. Its scale already suggesting the grandeur the finished building was meant to embody. But even as this third story neared completion, something had already begun to go wrong beneath the surface. Something the builders themselves may have first noticed, not through any dramatic event, but through small, nagging discrepancies. A plumb line that no longer hung quite true against the wall. A horizontal course of stone that no longer sat quite level from one side of the tower to the other. A sense, perhaps at first dismissed as an error in the laying of a single course of masonry, that something in the structure was shifting. The tower, still rising, still not yet complete even in its first intended stage, had begun to sink. And it was sinking, crucially, not evenly, not as a whole structure settling uniformly downward into ground that yielded the same amount everywhere beneath it, but unevenly, more on one side than the other, a slow tilting that would only become more pronounced as more weight was added above. The cause, though not understood by the builders at the time, is understood well enough now by geologists and engineers who have studied the site in the centuries since. The soil beneath the tower's southern side, it would eventually be determined, contained a somewhat different composition and structure than the soil beneath the northern side, softer in places, more prone to compress under the pressure exerted by the enormous weight of the growing stone cylinder above it. As the tower rose, story by story, the load it placed upon the ground beneath it grew heavier, and the ground, unable to bear that load with any consistency across its own uneven internal structure, began to give, not in a moment, not in a collapse, but in the slow, silent compression of clay particles pressed ever more tightly together beneath the stone. A process invisible to the eye, and yet already, even at this early stage, measurable to anyone willing to check a level against a wall. Some later historians have suggested the builders noticed this tilt and attempted, in these earliest years, to make small adjustments, perhaps setting certain stones fractionally thicker on one side of a course than the other, in an early and largely instinctive effort to correct what they could see occurring before them. Whether this was truly the case, or whether such asymmetries were the simple product of ordinary construction variance rather than deliberate correction, remains a matter of some scholarly disagreement, the physical evidence in the stones themselves open to more than one interpretation. What is not in dispute is that by the time the third story neared its completion, the tower's lean, however slight it may have appeared to the eye at that early point, was already a measurable and real condition of the structure. Not a later development, but a problem present from nearly the very beginning of the building's life. The tower, in other words, had begun to lean before it had even finished being built for the first time, long before it earned the name history would eventually give it, long before any bell had rung from a chamber that did not yet exist, and long before anyone standing in that square could have imagined how long, and how strangely, this particular problem of ground and stone would go on to occupy the attention of the world. By the time the third story had been raised, sometime around 1178 by the estimates that survive in the fragmentary records of the Works Committee, the tower already carried within its stones the quiet evidence of trouble. The masons working at that height, laying the arcades and the blind arches that would come to define the tower's outer face, could see it in the way their plumb lines refused to hang true against the rising wall, in the way a story that should have stood level with the one below it instead crept away, however slightly, toward the south. What they could not have known, what no one in that city could have known, was that the very interruption about to fall upon their work, an interruption born of politics and war rather than of engineering judgment, would do more to save their tower than any decision they themselves might have made. The pause came, as pauses so often did in that century of Italian city-states, not because anyone chose to stop for the tower's sake, but because Pisa itself was drawn back into the long, grinding contest for power that defined so much of Tuscan and Ligurian life in that period. The Republic's wealth and its fleet had made it many rivals, and by the 1180s and into the decades that followed, Pisa found itself once again committed to conflicts with Genoa, across the sea lanes it had long contested, and with Lucca and Florence across the inland borders that separated one ambitious city from another. These were not distant skirmishes fought by men whose names meant nothing to the workshops of the cathedral square. They drew away the funds that had once flowed toward marble and scaffolding, and they drew away, too, the labour itself. The very masons and stonecutters and labourers who might otherwise have continued climbing the tower story by story. A republic at war has little coin left over for bell towers, however important they might seem to the dignity of its cathedral complex. And Pisa, like every maritime power of that age, found its treasury and its attention pulled again and again toward the ships and the soldiers that its survival actually depended upon. The records that survive from this period are, as with so much of the tower's early history, incomplete and scattered across archives that time and fire and the general carelessness of centuries have not treated kindly. No single document explains, in the way a modern reader might wish, exactly why work ceased when it did, or precisely how long the silence lasted. The historians who have pieced together the chronology from scattered notarial records, from mentions in chronicles of the period, and from the physical evidence of the stone itself, generally agree that the pause extended for something close to a century, though the exact span remains a matter of scholarly reconstruction rather than certain record. What is clear is that for a very long stretch of time, long enough for a child born, the year the third story was completed, to grow old and die, without ever seeing a fourth story added, the tower stood exactly as it was, a truncated stump of white and grey marble, rising only part-way toward whatever height its original designers had imagined for it. It is worth pausing here, as the builders themselves were forced to pause, and considering what that unfinished tower must have looked like to the people of Pisa, who passed it day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The cathedral beside it stood complete, its facade catching the light off the nearby river and the not-so-distant sea, a finished statement of the city's wealth and piety. The baptistry, begun around the same years as the tower, continued its own slow rise nearby, subject to its own delays and revisions, but moving, however gradually, toward completion. And between them stood this strange, stunted cylinder of stone, its arcades open to the sky at a height that must have seemed almost apologetic beside the ambitions of its neighbors. Grass would have grown up around its base, the great marble field where all three structures rose, surrounded by exactly the kind of unmanaged greenery that gives the square its enduring modern name, the Campo dei Miracoli, the Field of Miracles, though in those long decades of pause, it might more accurately have been called a field of waiting. The tools of the masons, we can imagine, though the specific inventories do not survive in any detail that would satisfy a modern archivist, would have been stored away in whatever sheds and workshops the cathedral works maintained nearby. Chisels and mallets and the wooden templates used to guide the carving of each repeating arch. All of it waiting through years when no one came to use them for this particular purpose. Some of these craftsmen would have moved on to other work, to other cities perhaps, to other churches and towers under construction elsewhere in a peninsula that was, in this period, extraordinarily busy with the raising of stone. Others may have remained in Pisa, taking up work on the baptistry or on other civic and religious buildings, their skills too valuable to the guild simply to sit idle, waiting for a war to end. The specific men who had shaped the third story's arcades were very likely not the same men who would eventually be called back, generations later, to continue the climb. For the span of time involved exceeds by a comfortable margin the working life of any single mason, however long and however skilled. This is the part of the tower's story that engineers and historians alike have come to regard with a kind of quiet astonishment, because what looked, and indeed what was, an unplanned and unwelcome interruption, a delay forced upon the project by circumstances entirely outside the control or intention of anyone connected with its design, turned out to serve the one purpose that no contemporary engineering knowledge could have deliberately provided. The soil beneath the tower, that unstable mixture of clay and fine sand and marine sediment left behind by the ancient advance and retreat of the sea, is not a material that responds well to sudden loading. Weight placed upon it quickly, story stacked rapidly upon story in the enthusiastic push toward completion that might have seemed only natural to an ambitious building committee, would have driven the foundation down and sideways far more severely and far more suddenly than the slow tilt that history actually recorded. But a structure left to stand at a partial height for the better part of a century is, in effect, given the gift of time, and time is precisely what waterlogged and compressible ground requires in order to consolidate, to settle its particles into a somewhat firmer arrangement, to squeeze out the trapped moisture gradually rather than being asked to bear a sudden and catastrophic burden all at once. Modern geotechnical engineers, working many centuries later with instruments and calculations entirely unavailable to the original builders, have come to describe this long pause as something close to a fortunate accident, an interruption that inadvertently allowed the ground to begin adjusting to the load already placed upon it, before any additional weight arrived to compound the difficulty. Had the original builders possessed the funds and the peace to continue building steadily upward through the 1180s and into the early 90s, stacking a fourth story atop the third and a fifth atop the fourth in the same rhythm that had carried the tower from its foundation stone through its first 3 levels, the added weight arriving upon ground that had not yet had any opportunity to settle beneath the burden it already carried, might easily have produced a far more severe tilt, or worse, an outright structural failure of the kind that toppled other ambitious towers of that same restless architectural age. Instead, the wars that Pisa fought against Genoa and against its inland rivals, wars that must have seemed at the time like nothing but a drain on the city's fortune and a source of anxiety and loss for its people, gave the tower's foundation nearly 100 years to settle into whatever equilibrium the soft ground beneath it was capable of finding. There is something worth sitting with in this, a kind of reflection that the tower itself seems almost built to invite, though no one intended it to teach any lesson at all. The structure that would eventually become one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth, admired specifically for the improbable angle at which it leans, owes at least part of its survival not to any brilliance in its original design, which was, after all, deeply flawed from its very first stones, and not to any particular wisdom on the part of the men who eventually returned to finish it, but to the simple accident of interrupted ambition. Chance in the form of distant battles and treasury shortfalls that had nothing whatsoever to do with soil mechanics or structural engineering shaped the tower every bit as much as any drawing or any mason's skill. It is a strange kind of comfort, perhaps, to consider that an unplanned century of delay, born of conflicts long since forgotten by most who now stand in that square and photograph the tower's famous tilt, may have quietly done more to preserve the building than anything its architects ever intended. The field lay quiet through those decades, the truncated tower rising only to its 3rd story against the Tuscan sky, its arcades open and empty, its ambitions paused indefinitely by forces entirely beyond the control of anyone who had laid its first stone. And somewhere beneath that patient, unfinished structure, in the dark and saturated ground that no one could see or measure, the slow work of settling continued, unhurried and unnoticed, buying time for a building that did not yet know how much it would eventually need it. When the work resumed, it did so quietly, without fanfare, in a manner that matched the long silence that had preceded it. The historical record places the renewal of construction somewhere near 1198, though the sources disagree on the precise year, and some accounts suggest the true return of masons to the site may have come a few years later still. What can be said with more confidence is that by the time building resumed in earnest, nearly a century had passed since Bonanno Pisano and his fellow craftsmen had set down the first stones of the foundation, and the world around the tower had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The wars that had drawn away funds and men had shifted in their fortunes. Pisa itself had weathered storms of its own, both political and financial, and the maritime wealth that had first conceived of the tower as a symbol of civic pride had continued in fits and starts to accumulate. It was this renewed prosperity, historians believe, that finally allowed the city to turn its attention back to the unfinished bell tower, standing silent in its field of green. The direction of this second phase of construction is generally attributed to a man named Giovanni di Simone, though here again the record is not without its uncertainties. Giovanni was a Pisan architect of some local reputation, associated with other significant building projects of the city during this period, and it is to him that most surviving accounts assign the responsibility for continuing the tower's construction. Whether he inherited detailed plans from Bonanno's era, whether he consulted with masons who remembered the original intentions, or whether he was forced to improvise entirely new solutions to a problem that had never before been faced in quite this way, no single document survives to say for certain. What is clear from the physical evidence embedded in the stone itself is that whoever directed this second phase of building understood that the tower could not simply continue upward as though nothing had happened. The lean was now unmistakable. The third story sat perceptibly askew atop the second, and continuing to build in a straight vertical line above that tilted foundation would have only worsened the imbalance with each new course of marble laid down. Something had to be done, and what was done has become, in the centuries since, one of the most quietly remarkable engineering decisions in the history of the building. The solution devised was not to correct the lean directly, for such a thing lay beyond the capacity of medieval construction to achieve. Instead, the builders under Giovanni di Simone's direction chose a different path entirely, one that acknowledged the tilt rather than fighting it outright. Each new story added to the tower was constructed with a slight counter-angle, relative to the story beneath it, a subtle correction built into the stonework itself, intended to compensate, however imperfectly, for the tower's continuing lean. The masons did not attempt to force the tower back to true vertical in a single dramatic adjustment, which would have required demolishing and rebuilding much of what already stood. Instead, they introduced a gentle curvature, story by story, each level angled slightly back toward the vertical, relative to the one below it, so that the tower began, ever so slowly, to bend back upon itself, even as it continued to lean as a whole. It is this decision, made sometime in the final years of the 12th century, or the opening years of the 13th, that gives the tower its faint and distinctive curve when viewed from certain angles today, a subtlety that many visitors overlook entirely. So accustomed are they to focusing only on the dramatic angle of the lean itself. The construction that followed added the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th stories to the structure, a process that unfolded gradually across the middle decades of the 13th century. Each new level brought with it fresh uncertainty. The masons working atop the tower could not have known, with any scientific precision, how the ground beneath them would respond to each new addition of weight. They worked instead from observation and accumulated experience, watching how the tower had behaved during its long century of dormancy, measuring as best their era allowed the angle of the tilt, and adjusting their construction accordingly. The counter-angling technique was not applied uniformly or mathematically in the way a modern engineer might calculate a precise correction. It was instead a gradual, almost intuitive process, built up empirically as the tower rose, with each story's masons responding to what they could see and measure of the story below, making small adjustments that, cumulatively, produced the tower's gentle banana-like curve. Later scholars, studying the tower's construction centuries afterward, would remark on the peculiar wisdom embedded in this seemingly simple approach. It was not a solution born of advanced theoretical knowledge, for the mathematics of soil mechanics and structural correction lay centuries in the future. It was instead a solution born of patience, of careful observation, and of a willingness to work with the building's flaw rather than against it, to accommodate imperfection rather than to insist upon an impossible perfection. There is something worth pausing over in the sheer risk that this continued construction represented. To build atop an already leaning tower, adding 4 additional stories of stone and marble to a structure already known to be unstable, was to gamble with an enormous weight of material and an equally enormous weight of civic ambition against a foundation whose true condition could never be fully known. The masons and laborers who climbed the scaffolding to lay each new course of stone did so without the benefit of any modern instrument that could tell them precisely how much further the tower might tilt, or whether the addition of a 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th story might be the addition that finally proved too much for the softened, saturated clay below. They worked, in other words, in a state of sustained uncertainty, trusting to accumulated observation and to a kind of practical faith that the building would continue to hold, as it had held through the long century of its abandonment. This was not recklessness precisely, for the century-long pause had given the ground time to settle and had allowed the builders to observe the tower's behavior across a considerable span of years before resuming their work. But neither was it certainty. Every stone laid during this second phase of construction represented a small act of faith, a wager that the tower's foundations, however compromised, could bear the weight of continued ambition. The years during which Giovanni di Simone directed this work were not, by most accounts, free of interruption themselves. Some sources suggest that construction again slowed or paused at various points during the 13th century, whether due to renewed military conflict, financial strain, or simply the practical difficulties of building upon so troubled a foundation. The precise chronology of these additional pauses is not fully settled among historians, and the sources that survive from this period are fragmentary, offering glimpses rather than a continuous record. What can be said is that the completion of the 7th story, bringing the tower to a height just short of its final form, took place by approximately 1272, more than 70 years after construction had resumed, and nearly a full century after the first stone had been laid in the field beside the cathedral. The tower that stood at this point, 7 stories tall, its subtle countercurve now visible to any careful observer, already bore the essential character that would define it for all the centuries to come. It leaned unmistakably toward the south, and yet it also curved, gently and almost imperceptibly. Back against that lean, a structure caught in a kind of frozen argument with itself, one side arguing for collapse and the other, through the quiet ingenuity of its builders, arguing for endurance. And yet, despite this remarkable corrective effort, the tower continued its slow southward tilt, even as the new stories were added. The counter-angling built into each level could compensate only for the tilt that had already occurred at the time that level was constructed. It could do nothing to prevent the continued settling of the ground beneath the tower, as additional weight was piled atop the existing structure. Each new story, however cleverly angled to correct for the lean already present, added yet more mass to a foundation that had never been adequate to the task from the very beginning. The clay and sand layers beneath the tower's base continued their slow, uneven compression under this growing burden, and the tower continued, story by story, to sink deeper into the southern side of its foundation, even as it rose higher into the Tuscan sky. The correction, in other words, could soften the visual severity of the problem, and could perhaps slow its most dramatic consequences, but it could not resolve the underlying cause. The ground itself remained unequal to the weight being asked of it, and no amount of careful masonry could alter the fundamental physics of an uneven foundation bearing an ever-increasing load. By the time the seventh story was completed, the lean was more pronounced than it had been when construction paused a century earlier, even accounting for the gentle correction folded into the stonework. The tower had grown taller, more magnificent, and more precarious all at once, a structure whose beauty and whose danger had become, by this point, inseparable from one another. Each new addition of stone, a fresh testament to both the ambition and the peril that had characterized this project since its very first days in the soft, unsuspecting ground of the Campo. What remained, after that seventh story had settled into place, and the masons had once again withdrawn their scaffolding to survey what they had made, was a single task that many in Pisa must have wondered whether they would live to see. The tower needed its crown, a structure built to hold bells, to give voice to the cathedral complex below, could not be considered whole without the chamber that would house them. And so the final phase of construction began, though by now the city that had first conceived of this tower was scarcely recognizable as the same place. The merchants who had funded the earliest stones were long dead. The masons who had puzzled over the widening cracks after the third story were gone as well. Their names recorded only fragmentarily, if at all, in the surviving documents that chroniclers and archivists would later comb through in the hope of reconstructing a history that had unfolded across so many hands and so many decades that no single narrative could ever fully contain it. It fell, in this final stretch, to a man named Tommaso di Andrea Pisano, an architect and sculptor whose family had long-standing associations with the cathedral works, to bring the tower to its conclusion. The years given for this completion, according to the records that survive, cluster around 1372, though, as with so much of the tower's history, the precision of that date rests on documents that are themselves incomplete, pieced together from account books, inscriptions, and the occasional reference in the writings of those who observed the works as they neared their end. By the time Tommaso undertook the final phase, the lean had become an undeniable fact of the tower's character. Not a flaw to be hidden, but a condition to be worked with, much as the builders of the 4th through 7th stories had done. The bell chamber he designed continued this same tradition of quiet compensation, angled once more to correct, however modestly, for the tilt that had accumulated beneath it. This was not a return to plumb, not a sudden reversal of the lean that had defined the tower for generations by this point, but rather a continuation of the patient, incremental adjustments that had characterized the entire building's slow rise. The chamber was set at its own angle relative to the stories below it, a subtle correction folded into the stonework so that the tower's crown leaned less severely, proportionally, than the body beneath it, even as the overall structure continued to tilt as a whole toward the south. It was, in this sense, the final chapter in a long conversation between the builders and the ground, a conversation that had begun with alarm and had gradually become something closer to accommodation, an acceptance that the structure would never stand straight, that it could only ever be coaxed toward a kind of leaning equilibrium, each story adjusting for the sins of those below it without ever fully correcting them. The bell chamber itself, was a more restrained architectural statement than the 7 stories of arcaded galleries beneath it. Its arches simpler, its ornamentation more subdued, as though the builders understood that after so many decades of elaborate white marble arcades circling the tower's girth, the crown needed only to gather the whole composition to its conclusion rather than to add some further flourish. And yet within this comparatively modest chamber came one of the details that later generations would come to treasure most, a detail that transformed the tower from a purely architectural curiosity into something with a voice of its own. 7 bells were cast and hung within the chamber, and according to the tradition that developed around them, each bell was tuned to correspond to a note of the musical scale. Whether this correspondence was precise in the way later chroniclers liked to describe it, or whether it reflects a somewhat romanticized retelling of a more approximate reality, the sources do not allow us to say with total certainty. But the association between the tower's bells and the musical scale became, over the centuries that followed, one of the enduring pieces of lore attached to the structure, repeated by visitors and historians alike. A small human detail that softened the tower's otherwise imposing engineering drama into something closer to song. Each of these 7 bells came, in time, to carry its own name. And though the specific historical record of their casting and naming grew more elaborate in later centuries than the sources from the 1300s can fully support, the tradition held that the bells were rung for different purposes and different occasions, their tones marking the hours, the calls to prayer, the civic announcements that a bell tower of this stature was expected to provide to the city below. This was, after all, the entire reason such structures were built in the medieval Italian communes, not merely as ornaments or as demonstrations of civic wealth and pride, though they certainly served that purpose as well, but as functional instruments of public life, their bells summoning the faithful to worship, marking the boundaries between the working day and its end, sounding alarms in times of danger, celebrating moments of civic triumph. The Tower of Pisa, however dramatically it leaned, however precarious its foundations remained to any observer who paused to consider the mathematics of the thing, was built to serve this same purpose as its plum and proper cousins throughout Tuscany. And the placement of these 7 tuned bells within its crown was the final act that allowed it to fulfill that civic function. To stand at the base of the Campo in the years just after Tommaso's completion of the bell chamber and to look up at what had been achieved was to witness something that had taken very nearly 2 centuries to bring into being. The first stone had been laid, according to the surviving accounts, in the year 1173, in a burst of civic ambition and maritime prosperity that Pisa would never again quite recapture in the centuries that followed. Between that first stone and this final bell, hung in its chamber, lay a span of time that had swallowed generations of builders, master masons, whose names appear and then vanish from the record, replaced by successors who inherited not only their tools and their techniques, but the specific, delicate problem of a tower that would not stand straight. It had swallowed wars as well, the long and bitter conflicts between Pisa and its rival maritime republics, struggles that had drained the city's treasury and its manpower at various points, and that likely contributed, alongside the engineering difficulties themselves, to the century-long pause in construction that had left the tower standing at only 3 stories for so long, a stretch of years. And it had swallowed successive city governments, each with its own priorities, its own relationship to the cathedral complex and the civic pride invested in it, some more inclined to fund the tower's completion than others. The ebb and flow of political will as much a part of the tower's slow rise as the ebb and flow of the soft clay and sand beneath its foundations. To think of the tower's construction in this way, as a project that outlasted so many human lifetimes, is to understand something essential about how differently the people of this era related to time and to the long arc of a building's completion than we so often do now. No single architect saw this tower from foundation to bell chamber. No single patron funded its entirety. No single generation of masons could claim the whole of it as their own work. It was, instead, a structure built in relay, each generation receiving from the last an unfinished, leaning, faintly troubling monument, and choosing, for reasons of faith or civic pride or simple stubbornness, to continue rather than abandon it. There must have been moments, surely, in those long decades when the tower stood incomplete at 3 stories, its truncated form rising oddly out of the cathedral square, when some in Pisa wondered whether it would ever be finished at all, whether it might simply stand forever as a monument to overreach, a permanent and faintly embarrassing reminder of the limits of ambition against the reality of soft ground, that it was not abandoned, that generation after generation chose instead to resume the climb, to add story after story with the same careful, patient adjustments for the lean, speaks to something in the character of the city and its people that valued the completion of this particular vision enough to carry it forward across wars, plagues, and changes of government. And so, with the placement of those 7 bells and the sounding of their first notes across the campo, the tower reached what can properly be called its first true finished state. It stood complete, all 8 levels accounted for, from the great cylindrical base, with its blind, arcading through the 6 stories of open galleries and up into the bell chamber that crowned the whole. And it stood leaning, unmistakably, visibly, already the object of comment from visitors who passed through Pisa and paused in the campo to look up at this strange and beautiful structure that seemed to defy, by the very fact of its continued standing, the expectations that any observer might reasonably have of a building tilted so far from the vertical. It was already, in these earliest years after its completion, both a marvel and a curiosity, admired for the delicate whiteness of its marble and the rhythm of its arcades, and remarked upon with a kind of wondering unease for the fact that it leaned as dramatically as it did, and yet somehow continued to stand, bearing its bells, sounding its notes across the rooftops of the city, as though daring anyone who looked upon it to explain exactly how such a thing had been allowed to happen, and how it had not yet come tumbling down into the soft grass of the field from which it had so improbably risen. In the years that followed its completion, the tower settled into a strange and quiet permanence, taking its place beside the cathedral and the baptistery in the wide green field that the people of the city had long called, with a simplicity that felt almost devotional, the field of miracles. The 3 structures together formed an ensemble unlike almost any other in the world of that century, each one raised in the same pale marble, each one carrying the same rhythm of blind arcades and rounded arches, so that a visitor standing at the edge of the field could look from one building to the next and feel that they had been conceived as a single thought, even though, as the record shows, they had in fact been built across generations, by different hands, under different patrons, separated by decades and even centuries of interruption. The cathedral had risen first, broad and serene, its facade catching the light in a way that seemed to soften the stone rather than harden it. The baptistery had followed, round and deliberate, its dome not yet complete in these years, but already suggesting the vast, hushed interior it would one day hold. And now the tower stood among them, slender where the others were broad, vertical where the others spread outward along the ground, and leaning unmistakably in a way that no design had intended and no architect had planned. Contemporaries who walked the field in these early years, according to the fragments of testimony that survive in later chronicles and civic records, seem to have experienced the tower with a mixture of admiration and unease that never fully resolved itself in either direction. Some accounts speak of visitors who found the lean genuinely alarming, who approached the base of the tower with a kind of instinctive caution, stepping back as though the whole structure might, at any moment, choose that day to finish the fall. It had seemingly been promising since its second story first tilted out of true. Other accounts, gentler in tone, describe onlookers who found something almost beautiful in the imperfection, who felt that the tower's lean gave it a grace that a perfectly vertical tower, however elegant, could never have possessed, as though the building had been given a kind of movement frozen in stone, a captured lean like a dancer caught mid-turn. And there were others still, according to the more devotional strands of the record, who read the tower's survival as something closer to a sign, a small and continuing proof that the ground upon which the cathedral complex stood was itself blessed, that the miracle the field was named for extended even to the improbable balance of a bell tower that should, by every ordinary expectation of stone and gravity, have fallen long before its bells were ever rung. None of these interpretations, the calm and the uneasy and the devotional, seem to have driven out the others. They appear, instead, to have coexisted, layered over one another in the way that a city's feelings about its own monuments so often do, each generation adding its own gloss to the last without ever quite erasing what came before. It was in these decades, too, that the earliest recorded observations of the tilt begin to appear in the written record, modest at first, more curious than scientific, the kind of remark a visitor might make in passing, rather than a formal measurement taken with instruments. Travelers who passed through the city in the years and decades after the tower's completion sometimes noted in letters or brief accounts that the tower leaned so noticeably that a plumb line dropped from its summit would fall well clear of its base, an observation that required no special training to make and yet carried within it, even in its simplicity, the seed of everything that scholars would later spend centuries trying to measure with greater and greater precision. These early notices tended to describe the lean in relative terms, comparing it to the height of a man, or the length of a stride, or some other everyday unit that made the strangeness of the tilt vivid to a reader who had never seen the tower with their own eyes. It would be a long while yet before anyone approached the tower with the instruments and the mathematical seriousness that later centuries would bring, before surveyors began recording the lean in precise units and comparing those units year over year to track its slow progression. But the impulse to measure, to try to fix in some durable form, the exact character of the tower's strangeness, appears to have begun almost as soon as the tower stood finished, as though the building itself invited a kind of attention that no ordinary bell tower would have received. Scholars in the centuries that followed would return to this impulse again and again, refining their instruments, refining their methods, and each time producing numbers that confirmed what the earliest visitors had already sensed by eye alone. That the lean was real, that it was significant, and that it did not appear, across the span of recorded observation, to be static. And yet, for all the attention the lean drew, the tower had not been built merely to be looked at. And in these early years it began, quietly and steadily, to perform the functions for which it had been raised in the first place. It was, above all else, a bell tower, and its bells, once installed in the chamber at its summit, took up the role that bell towers across the region had long performed, marking the hours of the day for a population that had few other reliable means of tracking time, sounding the call to prayer at the appointed intervals, and announcing, through the particular pattern of their ringing, the various civic and religious occasions that structured the rhythm of communal life. Each bell, according to the traditions that developed around the tower in the centuries after its completion, came to be associated with a specific purpose, a specific hour, a specific kind of announcement, so that a resident of the city who had lived beside the tower for any length of time could likely tell, simply from the sound and pattern of the ringing, what moment in the life of the city or the church calendar had just arrived. The tower's bells rang for the hours of daily prayer, calling the faithful toward the cathedral that stood beside it. They rang, on certain occasions, to mark civic events, the kind of announcement that in a city without newspapers or public address depended entirely on sound carried across rooftops to reach an audience that could not otherwise be gathered quickly. And they rang too in times of solemnity, in the slow and heavy tolling that many cultures of the era reserved for mourning, for the marking of death, so that the tower's voice moved across a full register of the city's emotional life. From the routine call of an ordinary morning to the grave weight of a funeral bell. In this sense, the tower took its place not merely as an object of visual fascination in the field of miracles, but as a functioning instrument of civic and religious timekeeping, its lean notwithstanding, its bells sounding across the rooftops with the same regularity that any properly built tower's bells might have sounded, as though the building had somehow separated its practical service from its structural strangeness, performing the one without apparent hindrance from the other. It was also in these years, gradually and without any single dramatic turning point, that the tower began its long relationship with fame, a relationship that would only deepen across the centuries that followed, and that shows, even in its earliest phase, the outlines of what it would eventually become. Travelers who passed through the region on pilgrimage, on trade, or simply on the kind of extended journey that educated people of means undertook in that era, began to record their impressions of the tower in letters, in travel accounts, in the kind of casual writing that was never intended for wide circulation, but that survives, in fragments, as some of the earliest testimony to how the tower was received by those who had not grown up in its shadow and therefore saw it with fresh eyes. These early visitors often expressed a particular kind of surprise, distinct from the reaction of the city's own residents, who had watched the tower rise, crooked over the course of their own lives, or had inherited an already crooked tower from their parents and grandparents, and had, in either case, had time to grow accustomed to its strangeness. A traveller arriving for the first time, by contrast, encountered the tower's lean all at once, without any period of gradual adjustment, and the written record suggests that this sudden encounter often produced a vivid and lasting impression, the kind that a person might carry home and describe to others who had never seen the tower themselves, thereby extending the tower's reputation outward from the city into the wider world of trade routes and pilgrimage roads along which such stories travelled. In this way, the tower began, almost from the moment of its completion, to accumulate a kind of fame that had less to do with its function as a bell tower and more to do with its identity as an anomaly, a structure whose chief distinction lay not in any single feature of its design, but in the sheer improbability of its continued standing. This reputation would take centuries to fully mature, would wait for the era of the printed word, and later still for the era of photography, before it became the kind of fame that could reach every corner of the world at once. But its beginnings can be traced to these early decades, to the letters of travelers and the notices of visiting scholars, to the first tentative measurements of the tilt and the first written expressions of wonder at a tower that leaned as though it meant to fall, and yet did not, standing instead beside its cathedral and its baptistry in the soft field where all three would remain, weathering the centuries together, long after the men who built them had been forgotten by name. In the years that followed the tower's completion, when the mortar had long since cured and the bells had settled into their rounds of ringing, the city of Pisa continued to hold itself as a place where the old authority of the church and the newer authority of learning met without much friction, each lending the other a kind of borrowed light. It was into this atmosphere, generations after the last stone had been set atop the bell chamber, that a young man from a modest Pisan family began his studies at the university that bore the city's name, a university already centuries old by the time he arrived, its lecture halls filled with the standard texts of natural philosophy, its curriculum still leaning heavily on the authority of ancient writers whose conclusions about motion and matter had gone largely unquestioned for the better part of 2,000 years. His name was Galileo Galilei, and though the record of his early life in Pisa is not as full as later admirers might wish, enough survives to place him there, walking streets that passed within sight of the tower, attending lectures in buildings that stood only a short distance from the leaning campanile, breathing the same river air that had settled over the field of miracles since before his family had ever set foot in the city. It is in this proximity, this shared civic geography of a young scholar and a famous tower, that one of the most enduring stories in the history of science took root, whether or not it happened quite as it has come to be told. The story, as most versions of it are passed along, holds that Galileo climbed to the top of the tower, or perhaps only to some sufficient height along its leaning face, carrying with him two objects of differing weight, and that he released them together to fall toward the ground below, watching to see whether the heavier object would strike the earth first, as the philosophy taught in the university's lecture halls insisted it must. The prevailing wisdom of the time, inherited largely from Aristotle and repeated without serious challenge across centuries of scholastic instruction, held that objects fell at a rate proportional to their weight, that a heavier stone must outrace a lighter one to the ground in a straightforward and common-sense expression of gravity's plain arithmetic. According to the legend, Galileo's demonstration overturned this assumption in a single dramatic instant, the two objects striking the ground together, or nearly together, revealing that weight alone did not determine the rate at which a falling body descended, that some more fundamental and uniform principle governed the motion of all falling things regardless of their mass. It is a story that has been told in classrooms and popular histories for centuries, often rendered with great confidence, the tower cast as the stage for one of the founding demonstrations of modern experimental science, the moment when observation began to assert itself over inherited authority. And yet, when the story is set gently beside the documentary record, the record proves far thinner than the legend's confidence would suggest. The earliest written account of the tower experiment does not come from Galileo's own hand, nor from any contemporary who claims to have witnessed the event directly, but rather from a biography written by one of his students, Vincenzo Viviani, composed many years after Galileo's death, at a time when Viviani was working to secure his teacher's reputation and legacy against rivals and critics who had, in the intervening decades, offered their own competing narratives of the era's scientific advances. Viviani's account describes the tower demonstration in general terms, without precise dates, without named witnesses beyond an unspecified gathering of professors and students, and without any surviving corroboration from other sources of the period who might otherwise have been expected to mention so striking a public event had it truly unfolded as described. Nowhere in Galileo's own extensive writings, which include detailed discussions of falling bodies and careful accounts of his experimental methods using inclined planes and pendulums, does he himself claim to have performed this particular demonstration from the tower. This silence is not proof that the event never occurred, for absence of documentation is not the same as evidence of fabrication, and it remains entirely possible that some version of the demonstration took place informally, perhaps witnessed by few, perhaps never thought significant enough at the time to warrant separate written record. But historians who have studied the question closely tend to treat the story with caution, noting that it may be, in whole or in part, a kind of retrospective shorthand, a vivid and memorable image constructed after the fact to summarize a set of ideas that Galileo did in fact develop and demonstrate through other, better documented means, using apparatus and methods that left a clearer paper trail than a single dramatic drop from a leaning tower ever could. Whatever the truth of the specific event, the broader questions the legend addresses were genuinely at the center of Galileo's scientific work during his years of study and early teaching. And it is worth pausing to consider why a demonstration involving falling bodies would have resonated so strongly within Pisa's particular intellectual atmosphere. The university where Galileo studied and later briefly taught had long served as one of the significant centers of learning in the Italian peninsula, its faculties producing physicians, lawyers, and natural philosophers whose training carried weight across the wider currents of European scholarship. Pisa in this period held a civic identity substantially built around this reputation for learning, an identity that existed alongside its older reputation as a maritime republic and its long architectural tradition expressed most visibly in the cathedral complex and its leaning tower. The city understood itself, in some meaningful sense, as a place where inherited knowledge was both taught and, increasingly as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, tested against direct observation, a shift in temperament that Galileo would come to embody more thoroughly than almost any other figure of his generation. It is this atmosphere of testing, of a slowly emerging willingness to set inherited authority beside careful measurement and see which one held, that the tower legend captures, even if its specific details cannot be confirmed with certainty. Regardless of whether the demonstration occurred precisely as later generations came to picture it, the tower became entwined with the story of science itself, its leaning silhouette absorbed into the popular imagination as a kind of monument to the birth of experimental method, standing now not only as a marvel of medieval construction, but as a symbol of the moment when careful observation began to displace unexamined assumption in the study of the natural world. This entwining did not require historical certainty to take hold. It required only the plausibility of the image, a young scholar climbing a leaning tower with two weighted objects, releasing them together into the Pisan air, watching them fall as equals despite the difference in their mass. The story offered, in a single vivid picture, an entire philosophy of inquiry, one that privileged the evidence of the eye and the careful repetition of trial over the comfortable authority of ancient texts. And it is perhaps this quality of the story, its usefulness as an illustration rather than its certainty as an event, that has allowed it to endure so persistently across the intervening centuries. Retold in schoolrooms and popular accounts, long after professional historians began quietly noting the thinness of its documentary foundation. Separate from the question of Galileo and his falling objects, the tower itself was drawing a different and more sustained kind of scientific attention during these same generations. An attention directed not at what could be dropped from its height, but at the structure's own peculiar behavior, its persistent and continuing lean, the slow shifting of its axis that had been evident since the building's earliest years of construction, and that showed no sign of resolving itself with time. Visiting scholars, engineers, and the more technically minded travelers who passed through Pisa began gradually to take informal measurements of the tower's tilt, comparing their figures against earlier accounts, noting whether the lean appeared to have grown more pronounced since the observations of previous generations. These early measurements were rarely systematic in the way modern engineering surveys would later become, lacking consistent instruments or agreed methods, often recorded only in passing within letters or travel journals rather than in any dedicated study. But they represent the first stirrings of what would eventually become centuries of careful, cumulative attention to the tower's structural condition, an attention that would only sharpen as engineering itself matured into a more rigorous discipline, capable of asking harder questions about soil, load, and foundation than the tower's original builders could ever have posed. In this sense, the tower occupied two distinct scientific roles even in this early period, one as a symbol, however loosely tied to documented fact, of the observational method that Galileo and his contemporaries were beginning to champion, and another as an actual physical subject of inquiry in its own right, a structure whose continued and visible instability invited exactly the kind of patient measurement and record-keeping that the new scientific temperament increasingly valued. Both roles would deepen with time, the legend hardening into popular memory, even as professional skepticism about its details grew among careful historians, and the structural questions surrounding the tower's lean, drawing an ever more attentive and technically equipped audience of observers who would, across the centuries to come, transform casual notice into exacting survey, and exacting survey into the long scientific effort that would eventually determine, with a precision no 16th century visitor could have imagined, exactly how much the tower moved, and why, and what might yet be done to hold it in place. That effort did not arrive all at once. It gathered slowly, the way the tower itself had gathered its lean, in increments too small for any single observer to notice, though the accumulation across generations became impossible to ignore. Through the 16th century, as the tower stood at the edge of a city whose fortunes rose and fell with the shifting currents of trade and politics, the structure continued its patient southward drift, the ground beneath its foundation yielding by fractions of a degree that no instrument of the age could reliably capture. Visitors who came to see the bell tower of the cathedral complex often remarked on the tilt as though it were a fixed and finished thing, a permanent curiosity rather than a process still unfolding beneath their feet. They did not know, and could not have known, that the stone they admired was continuing to settle, that the same soft clays and sands that had betrayed the builders centuries before were still compressing under the tower's enormous weight, still redistributing themselves in the slow, invisible language of soil mechanics that would not be understood in any rigorous sense for another 300 years. The 17th century brought little change in the tower's fortunes beyond the continuation of this same quiet subsidence. Pisa itself had by then settled into a diminished role, its once formidable maritime power long since eclipsed by rivals, its harbour silted and its political independence absorbed into the wider Tuscan state. The tower, in this sense, mirrored the city that had built it, a monument to an ambition that had outlived the circumstances of its own creation, standing now not as evidence of present power, but as an inheritance from a more assertive past. And yet, even as Pisa's civic importance faded, the tower's fame did not. If anything, the passage of time worked in the opposite direction, transforming a structural embarrassment into a source of civic identity, the floor becoming, gradually, the very thing that ensured the tower would never be forgotten. Scholars and travelers of the period, drawn partly by the reputation Galileo's name had lent the tower, and partly by simple curiosity, began to record their impressions with greater specificity than earlier chroniclers had thought necessary. Some attempted rough measurements of the tilt using plumb lines dropped from the upper gallery to the pavement below, a method simple in concept but limited in precision, dependent on wind, on the steadiness of the hand holding the line, on the accuracy of whatever rule was used to mark the distance between the line's resting point and the base of the tower. These early efforts, imperfect as they were, represent the first stirrings of what would become, centuries later, a formal and continuous program of monitoring. They reveal an important shift in how the tower was regarded. No longer merely a wonder to be marveled at, but a phenomenon to be measured, a structure whose behavior might be tracked, quantified, and perhaps someday understood well enough to predict. By the 18th century, as the broader currents of the Enlightenment encouraged a more systematic approach to the natural and built world, the tower found itself the subject of increasingly careful attention from architects, engineers, and natural philosophers who visited Pisa specifically to study its lean. Some of these visitors left behind sketches and written descriptions detailed enough that later historians could compare them against subsequent surveys, establishing a rough timeline of the tower's movement across the decades, separating one observation from the next. The picture that emerges from these scattered records is one of continuous, gradual, essentially uninterrupted subsidence. The tower's upper gallery drifting further from vertical with each passing generation. Though the rate of this drift was not constant, varying instead with factors that would not be fully appreciated until the following century. Seasonal fluctuations in groundwater, the redistribution of load as minor repairs altered the tower's mass and balance, and the ongoing consolidation of the clay layers deep beneath the foundation. Layers that continued to compress under a burden they had never been suited to bear. It was during these centuries, too, that a number of interventions were attempted, each undertaken in good faith, and each, in hindsight, more likely to have worsened the tower's condition than to have improved it. Cracks that appeared in the masonry, particularly around the lower stories where the compressive stresses on the tilted side were most severe, were filled and patched by masons working without any real understanding of the forces at play beneath the structure. Additional stone was sometimes added to reinforce weakened sections, a practice that, however well-intentioned, added further weight to a foundation already straining under more than it had been designed to hold. In at least one instance, according to accounts that survive from the period, an attempt was made to excavate soil from beneath the north side of the foundation, in the hope of allowing that side to settle and thereby correct the tilt. An intervention that produced the opposite of its intended effect, since removing support from beneath the raised side only encouraged further settlement on the side that was already sinking, deepening the very problem the effort had sought to solve. Historians examining these episodes centuries later would come to regard them as a case study in the dangers of intervening in a complex geotechnical problem without adequate understanding of the underlying mechanics. Though such judgments, of course, were available only in retrospect, built upon knowledge that the masons and administrators of earlier centuries simply did not possess. Through all of this, the tower endured. It endured the plague that swept through Pisa and the wider region in recurring waves across the medieval and early modern periods. Waves that emptied streets and filled burial grounds and altered, sometimes permanently, the composition and character of the city around the cathedral square. It endured the wars that passed through Tuscany, the shifting allegiances and military campaigns that touched Pisa directly at various points across its history. Campaigns that damaged buildings, disrupted commerce, and reshaped the political boundaries within which the city existed, and yet left the tower itself largely untouched, standing apart from the immediate violence even as the world around it convulsed. It endured floods from the Arno, the same river whose proximity had likely contributed to the softness of the soil that caused the tilt in the first place. Floods that on more than one occasion rose high enough to threaten the lower levels of buildings throughout the city, testing foundations across Pisa and leaving, in the tower's case, no record of catastrophic consequence. Though the relationship between periodic flooding and the slow saturation of the ground beneath the tower remains a subject that modern engineers have considered carefully, given how significantly groundwater levels are now known to influence the stability of the clay layers below. And it endured, simply, the passage of ordinary time, the accumulation of centuries in which nothing extraordinary happened at all, in which the tower stood through countless unremarkable days, through the changing of seasons, through the rebuilding and repair of the structures around it, through the slow transformation of Pisa from a maritime power into a university town known as much for its scholarly traditions as for its monuments. This ordinary endurance is, in its own way, as remarkable as any single dramatic episode in the tower's history, because it speaks to a kind of structural resilience that was never designed, never calculated, never intended by the builders who raised the tower in 3 widely separated campaigns across nearly 2 centuries. The tower survived not because its builders had solved the problem of the unstable ground beneath it, but because the particular combination of factors that caused its lean, the soft alluvial soil, the uneven compression, the shifting distribution of weight above never quite crossed the threshold into structural failure, remaining instead in a kind of prolonged, precarious equilibrium that held, against all apparent likelihood, for century after century. By the time surveying instruments improved enough to allow for genuinely precise measurement, a development that would not arrive in full form until the 19th century and would be refined further still in the 20th, historians and engineers alike could look back across the accumulated record of centuries and begin to reconstruct, with increasing confidence, the actual trajectory of the tower's movement over time. What they found confirmed what casual observation had long suggested. The tilt had increased steadily, if not always at a constant rate, from the earliest recorded observations through the present day, each additional centimetre representing not a sudden event, but the compounded result of forces working continuously, quietly, beneath a structure that gave every outward appearance of permanence, while, in fact, remaining in perpetual and measurable motion. This realization that the tower was not simply a fixed monument bearing an old and stable floor, but rather an object still actively subsiding, still actively at risk, would eventually transform the way both scholars and civic authorities approached the question of its preservation, setting the stage for the more urgent and more scientifically rigorous interventions that the tower's continued survival would eventually demand. But that transformation belonged to a later chapter in the tower's long life, one still some distance off from the slow, patient centuries of sinking that had, by degrees too small to notice in any single lifetime, carried the tower steadily closer to the limits of what its foundation and the soil beneath it could ultimately bear. By the time the 20th century arrived, the tower had already spent more than 700 years leaning. And for most of those centuries, the movement had been so gradual that it registered only in the careful notebooks of surveyors and the patient instruments of engineers, rather than in anything a visitor standing at its base might perceive with the naked eye. But the 20th century would prove different. The measurements taken across those decades revealed a rate of tilt that was no longer merely the slow continuation of an old settling process. It was, instead, an acceleration, and one that would eventually alarm not only the engineers who studied it, but the wider world that had come to regard the tower as a fixed and permanent feature of human achievement, a monument that had somehow always been leaning, and would, it was assumed, simply go on leaning forever. The numbers told a quieter and more unsettling story. At the turn of the century, the tower's inclination had already reached somewhere in the range of 5 degrees, though the surveys of that era, taken with the instruments then available, carried a margin of uncertainty that later scientists would work carefully to narrow. What was clear, as decade followed decade, was that the rate of tilt was not remaining constant. Each new survey, taken often by teams working with growing precision as the tools of geodesy improved, showed the tower continuing to lean further, the southward drift of its upper gallery increasing by small but measurable increments year upon year. By the middle of the century, engineers monitoring the structure had begun to speak of the movement not merely as a historical curiosity, but as an active process, one that appeared, troublingly, to be gathering pace rather than settling into the equilibrium that many had long assumed the tower had already reached. The soil beneath Pisa, that same uneven mixture of clay, sand, and marine sediment that had first betrayed the builders 8 centuries earlier, remained as unstable and as unevenly compressible as it had ever been, and the tower's asymmetric weight continued to press down upon it in ways that scientists now began to model with far greater sophistication than any medieval mason could have imagined. It became clear that the very shape of the tower's foundation and the particular geology upon which it rested created a self-reinforcing mechanism. As the tower leaned further, its center of gravity shifted further still from the center of its base, which in turn increased the pressure on the soil at the lower southern edge, which in turn permitted further settling, which in turn increased the lean yet again. It was a slow and patient feedback loop, one that had operated quietly for centuries, but which, as the 20th century progressed, appeared to be entering a phase in which its own momentum might eventually carry the structure beyond the point from which any recovery could be made. By the 1970s and 80s, monitoring stations placed carefully around the tower's base were recording movement with an unprecedented level of detail, and the picture those instruments painted was sobering. Some measurements suggested the tower was tilting further by as much as 1 to 2 millimeters each year, a rate that, when compounded across even a single additional century, would carry the structure into territory no engineer wished to contemplate. By the early 1990s, the tower's lean had reached an inclination of just over 5 degrees, or roughly 4.5 meters of horizontal displacement between the base and the summit, a figure that placed it, by the calculations of the engineers now devoting themselves to the problem, uncomfortably close to what was understood to be a critical threshold, the point beyond which the tower's own weight, acting upon its increasingly precarious foundation, might no longer be sustainable. This realization, arriving gradually through the accumulated data of decades rather than through any single dramatic event, nonetheless produced a growing sense of urgency among the scientists, engineers, and civic authorities responsible for the tower's care. What had for centuries been treated as a curious but essentially stable oddity of architecture was now understood to be, in the plainest terms available to the specialists studying it, at genuine risk of collapse. The prospect was almost impossible for many to accept. The tower had leaned for 800 years. It had survived wars, floods, earthquakes recorded in the region's long seismic history, and the slow erosion of centuries, and it seemed, to the ordinary observer, simply inconceivable that it might finally succumb not to some sudden catastrophe, but to the quiet, patient continuation of the very process that had made it famous in the first place. Yet the data, gathered patiently by instruments that did not share in sentiment, suggested otherwise. In response, the Italian government, recognizing both the scientific urgency of the situation and the tower's significance not merely to Pisa but to the world, established in 1990 a commission of experts charged with studying the structure and determining what, if anything, could be done to halt or reverse its dangerous progression. This commission drew together engineers, geotechnical specialists, architects, and historians, each bringing a different discipline to bear on a problem that resisted any simple solution. The task before them was immense in its complexity. Any intervention would need to address not merely the tower's visible lean, but the deep and poorly understood behavior of the soil beneath it, all while preserving, so far as possible, the very characteristic that had made the tower a subject of fascination for centuries. To straighten it entirely, even if such a thing were technically possible, would have been to erase the tower's identity. To do nothing was, by the growing consensus of the Commission, to risk its eventual collapse. The challenge, then, was to find some careful, measured path between these two unacceptable outcomes. A path that would stabilize the tower without eliminating the lean that had become inseparable from its meaning. Among the earliest interventions attempted, before the more sophisticated soil-based solutions of later years were developed, was a relatively direct and almost blunt approach, one that reflected both the urgency of the moment and the limits of what could be attempted quickly. Engineers arranged for lead counterweights, cast as heavy ingots, to be placed at the base of the tower on its northern side, the side opposite the direction of the lean, in an effort to offset, however partially, the uneven distribution of weight that was driving the continued tilt. These lead weights, stacked in visible rows around the tower's lower masonry, were not intended as a permanent or elegant solution, but rather as an urgent, temporary measure, a way of buying time while more considered interventions could be studied and designed. The site of the ancient tower, its pale marble galleries rising as they always had into the Tuscan sky, now ringed at its base with stacked lead ingots, offered a striking and somewhat sobering image, a visible reminder that a structure so long celebrated for its beauty had become, in that moment, a patient under careful and anxious medical observation. The counterweights provided some measure of stabilization, slowing though not eliminating the rate of further tilt, and their presence bought the Commission valuable time to study the problem more deeply. But the underlying concern remained. And as the risk assessments conducted through the early 1990s continued to suggest that the tower's condition demanded the most cautious possible approach, the decision was made in 1990 to close the tower to the public entirely. It was a quiet decision, arrived at through careful deliberation rather than sudden alarm, but it carried with it a weight of its own, a recognition that the structure which had welcomed visitors, scholars and pilgrims for the better part of 8 centuries could no longer be considered entirely safe for those who wished to climb its spiral stair and stand upon its bell chamber. For the people of Pisa, and for the countless visitors who had long included the tower in their itineraries through Tuscany, the closure represented something more than a mere safety measure. It marked, in its own understated way, a kind of pause in the tower's long relationship with the world, a moment in which the structure that had so long been a stage for human presence, for footsteps climbing its worn stone stairs, and for hands resting upon its marble balustrades, stood instead alone, its interior silent, its gallery empty, while outside the scaffolding of scientific study slowly assembled around it. The closure would last more than a decade, a duration few could have predicted at the time it was first announced. And throughout those years, the tower remained a subject of careful, continuous observation. Its every small movement recorded, analyzed, and debated by the specialists who had taken on the responsibility of determining its fate. News of Pisa's dilemma did not remain confined to Italy. As word spread of the tower's accelerating tilt and its subsequent closure, engineers, geologists, and structural specialists from many countries turned their attention to the problem, offering proposals that ranged from the cautious to the elaborate. Some suggested methods of soil reinforcement, others proposed mechanical anchoring systems. Still others offered more radical interventions involving the tower's very foundation. International conferences were convened, papers were published across a range of engineering journals, and the tower, for a time, became a shared puzzle for the global community of structural and geotechnical engineers, each contributing insight, critique, and calculation to a debate that would, in time, produce one of the most carefully considered engineering interventions of the era, though the details of that eventual solution belonged to the years still to come, as the Commission continued its slow, deliberate work of determining precisely how much soil, how much weight, and how much history could be safely adjusted without disturbing the delicate balance the tower had maintained, however precariously, for 800 years. The Commission that had gathered in the wake of the closure did not move quickly, and it did not move quickly by design. Among its members was a British soil mechanics engineer named John Burland, a professor whose long career had been built upon the patient study of how ground yields beneath weight. And it was Burland, together with a shifting company of Italian, British, and other European specialists, who would come to shape the intervention that finally answered the question the tower had posed for 8 centuries. The 1990s became, for this quiet international fellowship, a decade of models and measurements, of small proposals raised and set aside, of methods considered and found wanting, each rejected not out of haste, but out of a collective unwillingness to risk the one thing that could not be undone. The tower had survived neglect, war, subsidence, and the slow drift of its own foundations for the better part of a millennium. And no engineer wished to be remembered as the one whose intervention brought it down in an afternoon. The problem, reduced to its essentials, was one of removing enough support from beneath the tower's higher side to allow the structure to settle back toward the vertical, without removing so much that the ground gave way beneath it altogether. Early proposals had considered adding weight to the north side, the side away from the lean, in the hope that additional mass might press the foundation downward and slow the southward tilt. Lead counterweights were in fact placed at the base for a time, a temporary and visibly inelegant measure that nonetheless bought the Commission the years it needed to study a more lasting solution. Other schemes considered anchoring the tower with cables run to buried foundations at a distance, a method that had been used elsewhere with some success, though never on a structure so old, so tall, or so laden with the accumulated fragility of 800 years of settling stone. Still others proposed freezing the ground beneath the tower to stabilize it while more permanent work proceeded, a method drawn from mining and tunneling practice, though the risks of ice expansion beneath so delicate a foundation gave the Commission pause. It was Burland who came to advocate most persistently for a method that seemed, on its surface, almost too modest for so grave a problem: the careful, gradual extraction of soil from beneath the north side of the tower, the side opposite the direction of the lean. The reasoning behind it was simple to state and difficult to execute. If soil could be drawn out from beneath the higher side, that side would settle downward by a small degree, and as it settled, the tower would rotate very slightly back toward the vertical, easing its lean without ever fully correcting it. The method required no dramatic reinforcement, no visible scaffolding of cables or counterweights left in permanent view, no alteration to the tower's fabric at all. It asked instead that the ground itself be persuaded to accept a slightly different shape, and that the tower, resting as it always had upon that ground, would follow. The technique itself came to be called soil extraction, though the process was subtler than the name suggests. Narrow steel tubes were driven into the earth beneath the north side of the tower's foundation, and through these tubes, small and carefully measured quantities of soil were drawn out, a spoonful at a time, in a process closer to the patient work of a surgeon than to anything typically associated with heavy construction. Each extraction created a small void beneath the surface, and the ground above, and the foundation resting upon it, settled by the barest fraction to fill that void. The tower, ever sensitive to the state of the earth beneath it, responded by tilting very slightly less than it had before. The engineers were not attempting to straighten the tower, and they said so plainly and repeatedly to a public that might have hoped for a more dramatic correction. Their aim was calibrated and modest, to reduce the lean to a safer degree, to the angle the tower had held roughly a century earlier, before the drainage projects and groundwater disturbances of the 20th century had accelerated its tilt beyond what anyone considered a tolerable risk. A tower with no lean at all would, in any case, have been a different monument entirely, and no one on the Commission wished to erase the very quality that had made the structure famous across the centuries. The extraction work began in earnest in the middle years of the decade, following extensive trials and modelling, and it proceeded with a deliberateness that matched the extreme caution the tower demanded. Sensors placed throughout the structure and its foundation measured movement in increments too small for the human eye to perceive, tracking the tower's response to each extraction with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. Engineers monitored the tilt continuously, day and night, prepared to halt the work at the first sign of movement beyond what the models predicted. The tower, after all, had never behaved with perfect predictability. Its lean had accelerated and slowed across the centuries, according to forces not always well understood, and the ground beneath Pisa remained, as it had always been, a shifting and uncertain foundation for so much stone. To extract soil too quickly, or in the wrong location, risked inducing a sudden settlement that could crack the tower's foundation or destabilize its already strained masonry. undoing in an afternoon what 8 centuries of slow tilting had not achieved. The Commission's answer to this risk was patience of an almost unimaginable degree, extraction proceeding not in large, decisive interventions, but in a long sequence of small, closely watched adjustments, each followed by a period of observation before the next was undertaken. The work continued in this manner for several years, punctuated by careful review and, on occasion, temporary halts when monitoring data suggested caution was warranted. The engineers involved spoke, in interviews and technical papers written across this period, of the peculiar psychological weight of the undertaking, the awareness that they were adjusting, however gently, a structure that had become one of the most recognized symbols of human building anywhere in the world. A monument whose flawed and leaning form had outlived empires and made its way into the imagination of people who had never set foot in Italy and never would. There was no possibility of quiet failure. Whatever happened to the tower during these years would happen in view of a global audience that had, by the closing years of the 20th century, watched the tower's crisis unfold across newspapers and television broadcasts for more than a decade. The engineers carried this awareness into every measurement they took, and it lent the work an atmosphere less of construction than of careful, sustained tending, the sort of attention one might give to something both precious and fragile, neither of which could be replaced if lost. By the year 2001, the extraction work had achieved what the Commission had set out to accomplish. The tower's lean, which had reached its most severe point in the years before the closure, had been reduced by approximately half a metre at the top of the structure, a modest figure by the standards of ordinary construction, but a considerable achievement given the extraordinary care with which it had been won. The tower did not stand straight, and no one had wanted it to. It leaned still, visibly and unmistakably, at an angle that preserved every essential quality of the monument the world had come to recognize. But the degree of that lean had been drawn back to a point the engineers judged sustainable for centuries to come, provided the ground beneath it continued to be monitored and, where necessary, gently managed. The Commission described the achievement not as a correction, but as a stabilization, a word chosen with some precision, for the intention had never been to erase the tower's imperfection, but to ensure that imperfection would endure without collapsing into catastrophe. The reopening of the tower to the public took place in the year 2001 as well, following more than a decade of closure during which visitors had been able to view the structure only from the ground, unable to climb the interior stairway that generations before them had ascended without a second thought. The reopening was not accompanied by spectacle in the manner of the tower's earlier anniversaries or celebrations. It arrived instead as a quiet culmination of years of unglamorous labor, a moment in which officials and engineers gathered to declare the structure safe once more for the visitors whose footsteps had, across the centuries, become as much a part of the tower's history as the stone itself. Those who climbed its stairway again for the first time in over a decade found a structure unchanged in appearance, its ancient lean still evident to any eye, its bells still hanging silent and largely undisturbed in the chamber at its summit, its columns and arcades unaltered in their long familiar rhythm. What had changed lay entirely beneath the surface, in the quiet redistribution of soil that no visitor could see, and few would think to ask about, and in the confidence, hard-won and carefully measured, that the tower which had leaned for 800 years might now be permitted to lean for centuries more. It is tempting, when standing before the tower in the field of miracles, to imagine it as singular, an accident of ground and ambition unrepeated anywhere else on earth. The record does not support this comfortable belief. Pisa's tower belongs to a much larger family of leaning and precarious structures raised across the centuries, most of them far less famous, many of them built for reasons that had nothing to do with soil, and everything to do with haste or ignorance, or a simple failure to test the ground before committing stone to it. In the German town of Surhusen, a modest medieval church tower leans at an angle that, by certain measurements, exceeds even Pisa's own tilt, a consequence of a wooden foundation laid over marshy ground and left to settle unevenly across the centuries that followed. Surhusen's tower has never drawn the crowds that gather in Tuscany, has never been given its own chapter in the history of engineering, and yet it stands as a quiet reminder that the story told at Pisa is not a story about one unlucky architect or one unlucky patch of earth. It is a story about the meeting of ambition and geology that has played out in smaller and larger ways wherever builders have raised something tall on ground they did not fully understand. Other campaniles scattered across Italy tell variations of the same tale. In Bologna, the tower known as the Garisenda leans at an angle steep enough that Dante himself is said to have remarked upon it, comparing its overhanging bulk to a falling giant glimpsed from below. That tower, too, was built on soft, alluvial ground, its foundation shallow by later standards, its lean arrested only when its upper stories were removed to lighten the load and slow the tilt before it could progress to collapse. In Venice, a city built almost entirely on unstable ground reclaimed from lagoon and marsh, the Campanile of St. Mark's stood for centuries with its own quiet list before collapsing entirely in the year 1902. Its foundations finally overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of masonry pressing down on ground never meant to bear such a burden. That collapse, sudden and complete, stands in stark contrast to Pisa's long and patient tilt, and offers a sobering counterpoint to any romantic notion that leaning structures are simply charming curiosities of history. Some lean and endure, others lean and fall. The difference between the two fates often has less to do with the severity of the tilt than with the particular geometry of the ground beneath, the depth and consistency of the foundation, and the slow, largely invisible redistribution of stress within the soil itself. Factors that even modern engineers, with all their instruments and models, can only partially predict. Pisa's tower occupies a peculiar place within this broader company of precarious buildings. Not because its lean is the most extreme, though for many years it was frequently cited as such, but because it achieved a kind of fame that none of its counterparts ever approached. Part of this owes simply to timing and to circumstance, to the tower's location within a city already renowned for its maritime history and its university, to its placement within a field of white marble monuments that drew travelers long before photography existed to spread its image further. But part of it, too, owes to something less easily explained, a quality that separates Pisa from Surhusen or Bologna or the lost Campanile of Venice. And that quality has to do with the particular way in which the tower's floor became visible, not as a threat, but as a spectacle, something to be photographed, painted, and eventually held up in countless tourist snapshots, as though the visitor's own outstretched arm were bracing the ancient stone against its centuries-old tilt. No other leaning structure in the world has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular imagination as a symbol of imperfection made charming, made almost deliberate in its appeal, though the historical record makes plain that nothing about its lean was intended. Set within this longer human contest to build tall on uncertain earth, Pisa's tower represents both a failure and, paradoxically, a kind of triumph. The failure lay in the initial misjudgment of the ground, the decision to raise a heavy masonry structure on a shallow foundation set into layers of clay and sand never properly tested for their capacity to bear such weight evenly across the tower's base. This was not a mistake unique to Pisa's builders. It was, in fact, the common practice of the age, in which foundations were laid according to precedent and custom, rather than according to any systematic understanding of soil mechanics. a science that would not exist in any recognizable form for another 600 years. And yet the triumph, such as it is, lay in the response to that failure, in the willingness of generations of builders and engineers, beginning with the unnamed architects who adjusted the tower's upper stories to compensate for its early tilt, and continuing through the surveyors, mathematicians, and soil engineers who studied it across the 19th and 20th centuries, to work patiently with the flaw rather than simply abandoning the structure or tearing it down. In this sense, Pisa's tower stands not merely as a monument to a foundation improperly laid, but as a monument to the long, slow accumulation of human ingenuity brought to bear on correcting, or at least managing, an error too enormous and too visible to hide. This accumulated body of study, much of it hard-won through failure and near catastrophe at Pisa itself, left a lasting mark on the broader discipline of civil engineering. The tower's long history of settlement, tilt, and eventual stabilization became, over the course of the 20th century, something close to a foundational case study, taught in engineering schools and referenced in soil mechanics textbooks as an example of what can happen when a structure's foundation is not adequately matched to the ground beneath it. Where earlier generations of builders had proceeded largely on custom and intuition, the engineers who came to study Pisa in the decades following the World Wars brought with them an insistence on rigorous soil testing, on borehole sampling, on careful measurement of groundwater levels and clay composition before a single foundation stone was laid for any structure of comparable scale. The methods developed in part through the study of Pisa's own soil, the models of soil consolidation refined by engineers wrestling with the specific and maddening complexity of the tower's clay layers, went on to inform foundation design far beyond Tuscany, shaping the way engineers approached construction on soft or uncertain ground in cities as far removed from Pisa as Mexico City, where similarly unstable soils had long threatened structures built upon them, and Shanghai, where modern skyscrapers rise today on ground not unlike the reclaimed marshland that once cradled Pisa's own uncertain field. In this way, the tower's failure became, centuries later, a kind of quiet teacher, its long list across the horizon serving as a permanent and visible warning against the temptation to build without first understanding what lies beneath. And yet, for all this influence on the sober, technical world of soil surveys and foundation calculations, the tower's enduring legacy in the popular imagination has taken a very different shape. Where engineers see in Pisa a cautionary tale, the wider world has come to see something closer to a celebration, an embrace of imperfection so complete that the flaw itself has become inseparable from the structure's identity. Few visitors to the field of miracles arrive thinking primarily of soil consolidation or differential settlement. Most arrive already holding in their minds an image of the tower leaning, an image absorbed from postcards, film, and photograph long before they ever stood before the marble itself. The tower has become, in this sense, a rare kind of monument, one whose fame rests not on the perfection of its design, but on the visible failure of its foundation, a failure that any other structure might have sought to disguise or correct beyond recognition, but which Pisa's builders, unable to correct it fully, chose instead to accommodate, curving each successive story slightly against the tilt in an effort not to hide the lean, but to live alongside it. Here lies the deepest paradox of the tower's long history, a paradox that no engineer's model or soil sample can fully capture. The very flaw that threatened, across 8 centuries, to bring the entire structure crashing down into the soft Tuscan earth is the same flaw that carried its name and its image across the world, that filled the field of miracles with visitors long after the marble had lost whatever solemn religious purpose it was first raised to serve. Had the ground beneath the second story held firm, Had the tower risen straight and true as its architects surely intended? It seems reasonable to imagine that it might have taken its place quietly among the many fine campaniles of medieval Italy, admired by scholars of architecture but largely unknown to the wider world. Instead, the very instability that so alarmed generations of engineers, that drove centuries of study and intervention, and finally the great stabilization project at the century's close, transformed an otherwise unremarkable bell tower into one of the most recognized structures on Earth. Its danger and its fame bound together so tightly that neither can now be spoken of without the other. It is a strange inheritance for any building to carry, this fame built entirely upon its own imperfection. And yet, it is precisely this inheritance that the tower, standing quietly among giants, both leaning and upright, continues to carry into the present day. The tower stands today in a condition its earliest builders could never have imagined, and its most anxious observers, across 7 centuries, could scarcely have believed possible. It leans still, unmistakably, visibly, a tilt of just under 4 degrees from vertical, that remains plain to any eye that falls upon it from the piazza below. But the lean is no longer a source of dread. It is no longer watched with the held breath of an engineering profession uncertain whether the next season would bring collapse or reprieve. It is, instead, a known and measured quantity, a condition understood in numbers rather than fears, tracked by instruments that record its smallest movements with a precision the tower's medieval architects could never have conceived and would scarcely have understood. Where once the leaning was a mystery accumulating in silence beneath the surface, it is now a figure on a screen, updated and reviewed, folded into the quiet administrative rhythms of a monument that has become, in its old age, one of the most closely observed structures in the world. The stabilization completed at the close of the 20th century did not attempt to correct the tower's tilt so much as arrest its progress, drawing it back by a small and carefully calculated margin and then holding it there, a compromise between the tower's history and its future. The engineers who carried out that work understood, and said so plainly in their published findings, that the goal was never to make the tower stand straight. Such a thing would have erased the very quality that had made it famous, and more importantly, it would have required an intervention so aggressive that the ancient masonry itself might not have survived the correction. Instead, the work was calibrated to bring the lean back to a safer angle, similar to what it had been a century earlier, before the accelerated subsidence of the modern era pushed it toward what engineers had quietly begun to call a critical threshold. Since the completion of that project, the tower has held remarkably steady. Surveys conducted in the years afterward showed the tilt not only ceasing to increase, but, in the earliest seasons following stabilization, very slightly reversing, before settling into what the monitoring teams describe as essential equilibrium. It moves, when it moves at all, in fractions of a millimeter, changes so small that they exist only in the record, invisible to any eye and meaningful only to the instruments built to detect them. Those instruments now form an unseen skeleton of observation wrapped around the tower's ancient stone. Sensors embedded within the structure measure inclination continuously, recording the tower's position relative to true vertical at intervals throughout each day, building a dataset that has grown, year upon year, into one of the longest continuous structural monitoring records of any building on Earth. Additional instruments track strain within the masonry itself, watching for any sign that the marble and stone are bearing loads unevenly in ways that might signal new movement beginning beneath the foundation. Beyond the tower's own body, satellite-based positioning technology adds a second, independent layer of measurement, tracking the structure's location and orientation from above, with a precision fine enough to detect shifts the human eye could never register. Groundwater levels beneath the Field of Miracles are monitored as well, a direct descendant of the lessons learned from the drainage interventions of the 20th century, when engineers first came to understand how deeply the tower's stability depended on the invisible movement of water through the soil far beneath its base. Together, these overlapping systems of observation form a kind of quiet vigilance, not the anxious watching of an earlier age uncertain of catastrophe, but the steady, almost bureaucratic oversight of a structure whose risks are now, as far as engineering science can determine, understood and accounted for. A dedicated body of engineers and technical committees continues to review this data at regular intervals, a formal successor to the international commissions that gathered in the aftermath of the tower's 20th century crisis. Their work today carries none of the urgency that defined those earlier deliberations. There is no ticking clock, no annual creep toward collapse to be tracked and debated. Instead, their task is one of confirmation, of verifying, season after season, that the stabilization holds, that the tower remains where the intervention placed it, that no new and unexpected movement has begun to stir beneath the foundation stones. It is careful, patient, largely uneventful work, the kind that succeeds precisely by producing nothing dramatic to report. And it is work built upon centuries of accumulated understanding, drawing on the soil studies of the early 20th century. The structural surveys that followed each partial collapse elsewhere in the city, and the vast body of data gathered during the stabilization project itself. All of it now folded into a body of knowledge that allows engineers to speak of the tower's condition with a confidence that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations who watched it lean and could only guess at what moved beneath. While this quiet technical vigilance continues largely unseen, the tower's public life has taken on a rhythm entirely its own, one shaped not by engineering reports, but by the steady arrival, year after year, of visitors from every part of the world. Millions come each year to the Field of Miracles, drawn by the same quality that first made the tower notorious among the alarmed observers of past centuries. Its visible, undeniable lean, now transformed from a source of anxiety into a source of wonder, and, for many who arrive with cameras in hand, a source of gentle amusement. It has become, for reasons no engineer could have predicted, and no architect could have intended, one of the most photographed structures on Earth, not despite its imperfection, but because of it. Visitors position themselves at careful angles in the piazza, arms outstretched, palms flattened against the empty air, composing photographs in which they appear, through nothing more than perspective and patience, to be holding the great tower upright, or pushing it further into its tilt, or catching it as it falls. It is a small, almost universal ritual now, repeated countless times each day by travelers who may know little of the soil studies or the stabilization committees, or the centuries of anxious debate that once surrounded the structure, but who understand, instinctively, that the tower's lean is the very thing that has drawn them across however many miles to stand before it. There is something quietly fitting in this, though it is not a fittingness the tower's original builders could have foreseen or intended. The very flaw that so troubled the medieval builders, that halted construction for nearly a century, that provoked shifting the tower's upper stories in an attempt at correction, that drove Galileo and generations of scientists after him to study its behavior, that filled 20th century engineers with a dread bordering on obsession as the lean crept toward collapse, has become the tower's defining charm, the very reason for its worldwide fame, where a perfectly vertical bell tower might have remained a modest regional curiosity, admired locally for its marble and its bells, but largely unknown beyond the borders of Tuscany. This leaning tower has become instead one of the most recognized silhouettes on Earth, its imperfection so thoroughly woven into its identity that it is difficult now to imagine the structure any other way. Photographs taken in its shadow circulate endlessly, carried home to distant countries, tucked into albums and shared across generations, each one a small monument to the strange alchemy by which failure, given enough time and enough survival, can transform into wonder. Beneath this steady tide of visitors, the Field of Miracles continues its own quieter daily life, largely unchanged in character even as the crowds around it have grown. The cathedral beside the tower still holds its services, and clergy still move through its doors on ordinary mornings when the piazza is thick with tourists, and again on quiet evenings when the crowds have thinned toward the edges of the grass. Researchers, too, continue to pass through the grounds, some drawn by the tower itself and its long engineering history, others focused on the baptistry or the cathedral's broader architectural history, moving with notebooks and instruments among visitors more occupied with photographs and souvenirs. Groundskeepers tend the wide green lawn that gives the complex its gentler name, the grass kept trim beneath the marble monuments that rise from it. A patch of quiet cultivation at the center of what has become one of the most visited sites in the country. Vendors and guides occupy their familiar places at the edges of the piazza, offering their services to newly arrived travelers, while somewhere unseen, the sensors continue their steady recording, indifferent to the crowds passing above and around them, attentive only to the tower's continuing, imperceptible stillness. According to the engineering assessments published following the completion of the stabilization project, the tower's current condition is expected to remain stable for a period measured not in years or decades, but in centuries, provided the ongoing program of monitoring and maintenance continues without interruption. It is a projection offered with the same careful, hedged confidence that has come to characterize the tower's modern engineering history, an estimate built upon data and modeling rather than certainty, but one that stands in remarkable contrast to the anxious predictions of collapse that dominated discussion of the structure for so much of the 20th century. The tower that seemed, for a time, destined to fall within a generation, now stands, by the calculations of those who study it most closely, positioned to outlast the very engineers who stabilized it, and quite possibly their successors as well, continuing to lean, gently and permanently, into a future its long history of near disaster once made almost impossible to imagine. There is something worth pausing over, in the quiet after all of this, in the fact that the tower's most famous quality was never a quality anyone intended. No architect drew a leaning tower. No patron commissioned an angle of inclination as a mark of civic pride or divine ambition. The lean arrived as an error, a consequence of soft ground and heavy stone, and a foundation too shallow for the weight it was asked to carry. And for the better part of a century after construction began, that error was regarded by the builders themselves as a problem to be corrected, minimized, or at the very least concealed within the compensations of the upper stories. It was not celebrated, it was endured. And yet across the 8 centuries that followed, that same accidental flaw became the reason the tower survived. At all in memory, the reason it was drawn and painted and photographed far more often than towers that stood in perfect verticality. The reason travelers detoured across Tuscany to stand in a marble field and look up at something the earth itself had bent. A flaw left uncorrected for long enough had become identity. What began as a builder's failure to anticipate the softness of alluvial clay became, centuries later, the single fact by which the structure was known throughout the world. More thoroughly than its bells, more thoroughly than its function as a place from which the hours were once rung out over the rooftops of the city below. There is a strange grace in this, if grace is the right word for what gravity and clay and time arranged without any intention at all. A building meant to stand straight, to declare in stone the wealth and confidence of a maritime republic, achieved a form of permanence and fame that a straight tower, however finely proportioned, might never have earned. The imperfection did not need to be forgiven by history. History simply absorbed it and then reversed its meaning, until the tilt that once threatened ruin became the very reason ruin was so carefully, so persistently prevented. It is worth remembering, too, the sheer accumulation of hands and minds that this preservation required, spread across a span of time that dwarfs almost any single human life spent in its service. The masons who set the first ring of stone in the 12th century could not have known that the ground beneath their scaffolding would already be settling unevenly before their tower had cleared its third story. The builders who returned after the long pause, nearly a century later, adjusting each new course to compensate for a lean that had by then become impossible to deny, worked without any of the instruments that later engineers would use to measure inclination in fractions of a degree. They worked by eye, by plumb line, by the accumulated intuition of men who had spent their lives among stone and mortar, and their adjustments, however imperfect, kept the structure standing long enough to be inherited by those who came after. The engineer who finally closed the bell chamber, centuries after the first foundation stone was laid, built atop a lean that had already been decided by the ground itself, and could only shape the last story to something like balance within the limits that history had already set. And then, across the centuries that followed, came the scientists who turned their instruments towards the tower, not as builders, but as observers. The astronomer who is said to have used its height to test the behavior of falling bodies. The surveyors of later generations who began the long habit of measurement that would eventually produce a continuous record of the tower's movement. Decade after decade, a record built not by any one person, but by an unbroken succession of individuals who each contributed a single reading, a single year's observation, to a project none of them would live to see completed, because the project never truly concludes. And in the 20th century came the committees, the geotechnical engineers, the historians of masonry, the international panel of specialists who argued for years over whether to correct the lean, freeze it, or merely slow it, and who eventually settled on a method that intervened as little as history seemed to demand, removing soil rather than reinforcing stone, coaxing the tower back toward a safer angle rather than forcing it upright. Across 800 years, then, the tower was shaped not by one vision, but by the overlapping, often contradictory decisions of dozens of generations, each responding to the tower they inherited rather than the tower originally imagined, each leaving behind adjustments, records, and repairs that the next generation would in turn inherit and adjust again. It is difficult to think of many structures whose survival depended so completely on this kind of relay, this passing forward of responsibility across centuries, where no single builder's competence determined the outcome, and where the tower's continued existence became, in the end, a kind of collective inheritance, carried forward by hands that never met one another, and yet worked, unknowingly, toward the same end. There is a broader theme here, one that reaches beyond this single tower and touches something closer to the whole history of human building. Every structure raised into the air is an argument against gravity, a temporary suspension of the Earth's insistence on pulling weight downward and inward until it lies flat and undifferentiated across the ground. Most builders across history have tried to win that argument cleanly, seeking firm foundations, solid bedrock, symmetry that distributes load evenly so that no single point of the Earth is asked to bear more than it can hold. The tower at Pisa is instructive precisely because it represents an argument that was never won outright, a case where the ground refused the terms the builders proposed, and where the resulting structure survived not through victory over its foundation, but through an uneasy, centuries-long negotiation with it. In this sense, the tower stands as a kind of quiet reminder of the limits that press against every act of construction, however confident the design, however skilled the builders. The earth beneath any city is never perfectly uniform, never entirely predictable, and every foundation is in some sense a wager placed against conditions that can only be partially known before the weight of a finished structure reveals them fully. Most of these wagers succeed cleanly enough that they pass unnoticed, the ground doing exactly what the engineers expected it to do, the structure standing straight and settling evenly, its foundation never mentioned again once construction is complete. But occasionally, as at Pisa, the wager reveals itself openly, visibly, in a lean that cannot be hidden, and the structure that results becomes a permanent demonstration of the negotiation between ambition and earth that underlies every act of building, whether or not that negotiation happens to be visible. In this way, the tower is not really an exception to the ordinary history of construction, so much as a rare instance where the ordinary difficulties of foundation and ground were made permanently, unmistakably visible, where the private compromises every structure makes with the earth beneath it were pushed, by circumstance, into open view and left there for 8 centuries as something the whole world could see and wonder at. If one stands in the field today, in the hour just after sunrise, before the crowds have gathered, and while the light is still low and gold across the marble, the tower takes on a quality that photographs rarely manage to capture. The stone, pale by midday, turns warm and faintly rose-colored in that early light, and the long shadow the tower casts stretches across the grass at an angle that mirrors, almost exactly, the tilt of the structure itself, so that the shadow seems less like a projection of the tower and more like an extension of it, another version of the same lean laid flat across the ground. The cathedral beside it catches the same light more evenly, its facade glowing white and marbled, while the baptistry a short distance away holds its own quiet stillness, and the tower, tilted among these more conventionally upright companions, seems in that early light less like an error among correct forms, and more like a variation on a shared theme, one building among several that all rose from the same soft ground, that all settled by different measures, and that all continue, together, to define a field that has drawn travelers for the better part of 1,000 years. The birds that cross above the bell chamber in the early morning do so without any apparent awareness that the tower beneath them leans, and the grass at its base grows evenly in every direction, indifferent to the angle of the stone rising above it. It is a strange comfort, somehow, that the tilt which has occupied so many engineers and historians and worried officials across so many centuries means nothing at all to the birds, the grass, or the light, all of which continue exactly as they would around any other tower, straight or otherwise. And so the tower remains, tilted just slightly less than it once was, resting on ground that has been patiently, carefully coaxed back towards stability, watched over now by instruments too sensitive for any of its original builders to have imagined, carrying forward a lean that began as an accident and became, across 8 centuries, something closer to an identity. It stands as a reminder that imperfection, given enough time and enough careful attention, need not end in collapse, and that even the ground's mistakes can be shaped slowly and patiently into something worth preserving. For now, in this quiet telling, the story rests here, with the tower standing in the low gold light of morning, its shadow falling long and gentle across the field, and with an invitation offered softly to seek out more of these stories, more of these great structures raised by human hands against the patient, indifferent pull of the earth, whenever you next find yourself wanting a quiet history to fall asleep to.